A lone longship crests a wave in an ocean no European map had ever charted. We are about to trace 35 epic Viking expeditions that rewrote the map of the medieval world. By the end, you will possess a complete panorama of Norse ambition, from their first footsteps in America to their final, mysterious voyages. We will uncover why a thriving colony at the edge of the known world vanished without a trace, and what cryptic messages they carved in stone across continents. What does true exploration demand from those who dare to attempt it? This story begins not with a grand plan, but with a ship blown wildly off course. A Norse merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing for Greenland when a fierce storm swallowed his vessel. For days he was lost in a grey, featureless sea until a new coastline emerged through the mist. It was wooded and low, not the icy mountains he expected. Bjarni, focused on reaching his father, chose not to land. He turned his ship north, eventually finding Greenland, but he carried with him a tale of a strange, forested land to the west. His report was not of discovery, but of a mystery left unexplored. That mystery would ignite the ambition of Leif Erikson, son of the infamous Erik the Red. Leif sought out Bjarni, bought his ship, and assembled a crew to retrace that accidental route. He was determined to see this land for himself. Sailing west from Greenland, his expedition first reached a barren, flat country of stone slabs, which he named Helluland, the land of flat stones. This is likely modern-day Baffin Island. Sailing further south, they found a coast of endless white beaches and dense forests, which Leif named Markland, simply the land of forests. This is believed to be the coast of Labrador, but the true prize lay still further south. After another 2 days of sailing, they made landfall at a place of surpassing beauty. The sagas describe a river teeming with salmon, meadows perfect for grazing, and most importantly, wild grapevines. Leif named this place Vinland, the land of wine. He and his crew built sturdy turf-walled houses and spent a comfortable winter there, marveling at the abundance. They had done it. They had established a foothold in a new world, a place they called Vinland the Good. For decades, this story lived only in the Icelandic sagas, tales passed down through generations. Were they just legend? The answer came in the 1960s, when a Norwegian explorer and archaeologist named Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne Stein Ingstad made a stunning discovery on the northern tip of Newfoundland. At a place called El Ants Ox Meadows, they uncovered the unmistakable foundations of Norse buildings. The layout was identical to Viking Age halls in Greenland and Iceland. They found a bronze cloak pin, a stone lamp, and evidence of ironworking, a technology unknown to the indigenous peoples of the area at that time. This was not a fleeting camp. El Ants Ox Meadows was a small but permanent Norse settlement, a gateway. Yet the most tantalizing clues were not in the buildings but in the trash heaps. Archaeologists found butternut shells and pieces of wood from a tree called butternut, which does not grow in Newfoundland. Its range begins hundreds of miles to the south, around the Gulf of St. Lawrence and into New Brunswick. This simple, discarded snack is a silent witness. It tells us the Norse at El Ants Ox Meadows did not stay put. They explored far to the south, likely sailing into the St. Lawrence River system, gathering resources and scouting this vast new continent. They saw more of North America than we can ever fully know, so we are left with a profound and puzzling question. They found a land of incredible riches, better for farming than rocky Greenland or Iceland. They built a base and they explored deep into the interior. And then, within just a few decades, perhaps only a few years, they left. They packed up their ships, sailed east, and never returned to stay. The settlement at El Ants Ox Meadows was abandoned, leaving only silent mounds in the grass. Why would they give up Vinland the Good? The answer lies not in a single failure, but in a cascade of challenges that would define every Norse adventure in the West. The sagas give us a name for the people the Norse encountered, the Skraelings. This word, which might mean weaklings or screechers, reveals more about Norse perception than identity. These were likely the ancestors of the Beothuk, Micmac, or Dorset peoples. The stories tell of initial trade, furs exchanged for milk and cloth, but this fragile peace shattered. A misunderstanding over a traded weapon, a panicked Norse bull startling both sides. These small sparks ignited violent clashes. The Norse, with their iron weapons and chainmail, were formidable, but they were vastly outnumbered. The sagas describe a hail of arrows, and in one pivotal moment, a Norse leader, Thorvald Erikson, brother of Leif, was struck and killed by an arrow. He asked to be buried on a headland, calling it a fine place to live. His death marked a turning point, a stark realization that this land, for all its beauty, was fiercely defended. Conflict made every venture into the forest or up a river a potential ambush. Could a small colony survive under such constant threat? Yet warfare alone does not explain a full retreat. Maintaining a transatlantic lifeline was a monumental task. Think of the sheer distance. A voyage from Norway to Iceland could take a week. From Iceland to Greenland, another week in treacherous seas. From Greenland to Vinland, another daunting leg. This was a fragile chain of supply, each link vulnerable to the North Atlantic's fury. A single bad storm season could isolate Vinland for years. What was the economic reason to endure such risk? In Greenland, the Norse had a lucrative monopoly on walrus ivory, narwhal tusks, and polar bear furs, goods highly prized in European courts. In Vinland, they found timber and grapes useful but not nearly as uniquely valuable. The profit simply did not outweigh the peril and the price in human lives. Furthermore, the climate itself began to conspire against them. The medieval warm period that had blessed the North Atlantic was ending. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Little Ice Age was beginning its slow advance. Sea ice increased, making the navigation routes more hazardous and unpredictable. Colder temperatures in Greenland itself would have demanded more attention and resources at home, drawing focus away from distant, risky ventures. So the decision to leave was likely a quiet, practical one. After a few hard winters, after losing more men, after looking at empty holds that needed to be filled with something more than just stories, the settlers loaded their final ships. They took their tools, their remaining valuables, and sailed east, back toward the known world. The turf houses at El Ants Ox Meadows were left to slowly sink back into the earth. But did all traces of the Norse truly vanish from the continent? This is where history meets legend. In 1898, a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Oman claimed to have found a large stone tangled in the roots of a tree near Kensington, Minnesota. Carved into its face were runes telling a chilling story of Norse explorers who journeyed deep into the interior in the year 1362, only to meet a tragic end. The Kensington runestone has been debated fiercely for over a century. Most linguists and historians dismiss it as a clever hoax, its runic language and grammar an inconsistent mix. Yet it persists in the popular imagination. Other scattered finds, like the Maine penny, a genuine Norse coin from the 11th century found at a Native American site, or the Beardmore relics in Ontario, a set of Norse weapons, are often explained by trade networks or modern contamination. They are tantalizing but not conclusive proof of further settlement. They are the ghostly echoes of that brief, brilliant contact, whispers that keep the mystery alive. If Vinland was the grand experiment that failed, what came next for the Viking spirit of exploration? While Vinland faded into legend, the Viking compass still pointed east. A generation after Leif Erikson's western venture, a Swedish chieftain named Ingvar assembled an ambition of staggering scale. His goal was not the unknown Atlantic, but the fabled riches of the Orient. He gathered a fleet of perhaps 30 ships carrying hundreds of warriors, not for raiding, but for a grand expedition into the heart of the Silk Road world. They called their destination Serkland, the land of the Saracens, a Norse term for the Muslim realms surrounding the Caspian Sea. This was not a blind voyage into the blue, but a calculated journey along a superhighway of the medieval world, the river systems of the Rus. Ingvar's plan was brilliant in its logic. From Sweden, his fleet would sail across the Baltic to the trading settlements of what is now Russia. There, they would portage their ships from one great river to the next, moving from the Volkhov to the Dnieper, and ultimately down to the Black Sea or east toward the Volga and the Caspian. This was the same route used by Swedish Vikings, the Rus, who founded kingdoms and traded amber and fur for Arab silver. Ingvar was following in their wake, but with a force large enough to carve out a new destiny. The journey itself was an epic feat of endurance. Imagine dragging heavy wooden longships over log rollers across miles of forest and plain, facing unpredictable river currents and navigating territories controlled by various Slavic and Turkic tribes. It would have taken months, a testament to Ingvar's leadership and the sheer determination of his crew. They finally reached the Caspian, that vast inland sea bordered by empires. This was the threshold of Cirkland, a region of bustling bazaars, towering minarets, and ancient cities like Baku and Derbent, in what is now Azerbaijan and Georgia. And here, the historical record turns to silent stone. Back in Sweden, over 26 runestones still stand, raised by grieving families. They bear a hauntingly consistent message. One, raised by a mother for her son, reads, "He died in the east in Cirkland." Another says simply, "They died in the east with Ingvar. This is the mystery." A memorial stone typically celebrates a hero's death in battle, naming the foe or the place of a great fight, but the Ingvar stones offer no such detail. There is no mention of a glorious last stand against an emir's army, no tale of a great battle on the shores of the Caspian, just a uniform, tragic silence. He died in the east, so what happened to Ingvar the far traveler and his hundreds of men? Scholars have pieced together several grim possibilities, each more plausible than a forgotten battle. The first and most likely is disease. A large group of foreigners with no immunity to local pathogens arriving in a new ecosystem would have been devastatingly vulnerable. An outbreak of cholera, dysentery, or plague could have swept through the camp with terrifying speed, felling warriors without a single enemy arrow being loosed. Another theory points to the nature of their mission. Such a large force was expensive to maintain. They may have traveled as mercenaries, hiring out their swords to a local ruler in one of the endless Caspian border wars. If their employer was defeated, or if a contract went sour, the entire company could have been executed or sold into slavery, a fate considered so ignoble it was not recorded in runes. A third possibility is a simple disaster of logistics and geography. The Caspian is known for its sudden, violent storms. Perhaps the fleet was caught in a squall and shattered against a rocky coast. Or, venturing further south along the Silk Road, they could have been ambushed by bandits in a mountain pass, a mundane but fatal end for a quest that began with such grandeur. The Ingvar stones tell us a profound truth about Viking exploration. For every successful settlement or trading voyage, there were countless expeditions that vanished into the fog, leaving behind only a name on a rock and a question that hangs in the air for 1,000 years. The East had swallowed them whole, yet even as one trail went cold in the deserts of Cirkland, another was being blazed in the most unlikely of places, not by a fleet, but by a single, determined man walking into the white unknown. The silence of the Ingvar stones speaks of a quiet, distant end, but one Viking expedition announced itself with a scream that shattered the peace of an entire continent. In the year 793, on a small, windswept island off the coast of England, the world changed in a single day. The target was Lindisfarne, the Holy Island, a spiritual heart of Anglo-Saxon England and one of the richest monasteries in the Christian world. For the monks living there, it was a place of profound isolation and safety, dedicated to prayer and the copying of sacred texts. Their only sounds were the chanting of psalms, the scratch of quills on vellum, and the constant sigh of the North Sea. Then, on January the 8th, dragon-headed ships appeared on the horizon. To the monks, these vessels were like beasts from a nightmare emerging from the sea mist. The men who leaped from them were unlike any raiders they had known. They were pagans speaking a guttural tongue, wearing strange armor, and wielding axes with a terrifying, practiced efficiency. The attack was not a battle, it was a slaughter and a systematic looting. Monks were cut down at the altar, precious relics were torn from their shrines, and the monastery's famed library, a treasure house of illuminated gospels, was burned or scattered. Those who were not killed were dragged away in chains to be sold in distant slave markets. The Vikings loaded their ships with golden crosses, jeweled book covers, and silver plate, wealth that had taken generations to accumulate. Then, as swiftly as they came, they vanished back into the sea. The strategic calculation behind this raid was brutally simple, and it set a template that would be repeated for generations. Lindisfarne was phenomenally wealthy, a soft target packed with portable treasure, and it was almost completely undefended. The monks were men of peace, not warriors. The island was accessible by sea, allowing for a swift approach and a clean escape. For the Norse, it was less a military campaign and more a perfectly executed robbery of a bank that had forgotten to lock its doors. But the impact was far greater than the sum of the stolen gold. The psychological shockwave was apocalyptic. A contemporary scholar, Alcuin of York, wrote in despair, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain." He asked, what assurance is there for the churches of Britain if Saint Cuthbert, with so great a number of saints, does not defend his own? The raid was seen not just as a crime, but as a divine punishment, a sign that the very order of the world was crumbling. The Viking Age had begun not with a whisper, but with a roar that echoed in the chronicles of every monastery in Europe. From that day forward, coastal communities would look to the sea with dread, whispering a new prayer from the fury of the Northmen, "O Lord, deliver us." This single expedition did more than fill a few longship holds. It established a blueprint. It proved that the sea roads led to unimaginable wealth, and that the kingdoms of Christendom, for all their splendor, were vulnerable. The success at Lindisfarne lit a fuse. It told every ambitious Jarl and younger son back in the fjords that glory and fortune lay across the water for those brave enough to take it. And take it they would, in waves that would eventually crash upon the shores of France, Ireland, and even the sun-drenched coasts of the Mediterranean. But as one pattern was set in blood and fire, another, far more curious kind of Viking journey was taking shape, one driven not by greed, but by a desperate search for belonging in a world that was closing in around them. The fury of the Northmen reshaped coastlines, but the greatest discoveries often come not from ambition, but from pure accident. Long before Leif Erikson set sail for Vinland, another man saw the New World first, and his story is one of the most pivotal near misses in history. His name was Bjarni Herjolfsson, and he was not an explorer by trade, but a merchant. In the year 986, he was completing a routine voyage from Norway to Iceland, intending to visit his father, who had recently sailed with Erik the Red to the new settlements in Greenland. When Bjarni arrived in Iceland, he learned his father had already left. Showing a devotion that would define his fate, Bjarni announced to his crew they would continue on to Greenland, despite none of them having made the voyage before. They set out into the open ocean with only vague directions, a decision that would plunge them into a terrifying ordeal. For days they sailed with a fair wind, but then the weather turned. A dense fog fell, blotting out the sun and stars, leaving them directionless on a featureless sea. For many days they were utterly lost at the mercy of the North Atlantic. When the fog finally lifted, they saw a coastline, but it was all wrong. The sagas describe a land that was low and wooded with gentle hills. This was not the towering glaciers and stark mountains they expected of Greenland. Bjarni's crew, desperate after their ordeal, urged him to go ashore. They needed fresh water and supplies, but Bjarni refused. He was a man of singular purpose, focused on his original goal. He told his men this land looked unpromising, and he ordered them to turn the ship north, away from the unknown shore. They sailed along this mysterious coast for a time, seeing only forest, no signs of glaciers. Turning out to sea again, they found a second land, this one flat and covered in woods. Again the crew begged to land, and again Bjarni refused, insisting it was not Greenland. Pushing further north, they finally encountered a third land, this one mountainous and topped with a glacier. It was still not the right place, but here at last Bjarni relented. They did not go ashore, but they lowered a small boat and went in to collect fresh water. Soon after, they caught a favorable wind, sailed east for 4 days, and finally sighted the unmistakable cliffs of Greenland, reaching Herjolfsnes, his father's settlement. Bjarni's story could have ended there, a curious tale of a merchant's stubbornness. But when he later recounted his voyage, describing those strange, forested lands to the west, his report did not fade into rumor. It found its way to the ears of Leif Erikson, a man of a very different temperament. Leif was a visionary, the son of an explorer. Where Bjarni saw a distraction, Leif saw destiny. He sought out Bjarni, questioned him meticulously about the currents, the landmarks, the sailing times, and he even purchased Bjarni's very ship for his own expedition. Bjarni's accidental sighting became the foundational map, the only clue for the voyages that would lead to Vinland. This forces us to confront a haunting question, the expedition of the what if. What if the weather had been calmer? What if Bjarni's crew had mutinied and forced a landing on that first wooded shore? History pivots on such moments. Had Bjarni landed, he might have established a small camp, traded with the local people, or simply taken on water and left his mark. The Norse relationship with North America might have begun not as a planned colonization effort by Leif, but as an accidental contact by a pragmatic merchant. It could have accelerated the timeline of exploration by a generation, or it could have ended in immediate disaster, dissuading anyone from ever following. Bjarni's choice to turn away is a profound lesson. Discovery requires not just sight, but the courage to step onto the unknown beach. He provided the coordinates, but he lacked the explorer's heart. His legacy is that of a man who pointed the way for others, his name forever tied to a horizon he himself refused to cross. And as we follow the paths of those who did have that courage, we find that the Viking world extended far beyond the Atlantic, into realms of fire and ice that tested the very limits of human endurance. While Bjarni's story is one of caution, the next chapter belongs to a man who embraced risk as a way of life. After the failure of a rebellion against the Norwegian crown, a young prince named Harald Sigurdsson was forced to flee for his life. Wounded and hunted, he escaped east, not into the Atlantic, but toward the glittering heart of the known world. His journey would transform him from a fugitive into a legend and showcase the Viking spirit operating on a global stage. He is better known to history as Harald Hardrada, the Hard Ruler, and his exile was an expedition of pure ambition. He found his new home in the most magnificent city on earth, Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire. Here, the Norse were not feared raiders but prized soldiers. Harald joined the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of foreign mercenaries who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards and shock troops. These were the best warriors money could buy, and for a Viking of noble birth, it was the ultimate military academy. For nearly a decade, Harald fought in the empire's countless wars, from the sun-baked hills of Sicily against Arab emirs to the dense forests of Bulgaria putting down rebellions. He even traveled as part of a diplomatic mission or a military escort to Jerusalem, walking the sacred streets of a city that must have seemed as mythical as Valhalla to a man from the northern fjords. The sagas, written long after his death, paint his service in epic, often exaggerated strokes. They claim he became so wealthy and powerful in Constantinople that he caught the jealous eye of the empress. In one fantastical tale, he was thrown into a dungeon, only to escape by charming a visiting noblewoman who lowered a rope into his cell, which he used to shimmy to freedom. Another story says he played a role in blinding a Byzantine emperor during a coup. While historians doubt these specific events, they capture an essential truth. Harald was a formidable and disruptive force, a man who accumulated immense wealth and made powerful enemies in equal measure. His true treasure was not just gold, though he amassed a fortune in plunder and pay. It was experience. He learned advanced siegecraft, Byzantine military tactics, and the complex politics of a superpower. He was no longer just a Norse raider, he was a cosmopolitan commander. When he finally decided to return north, he did so with a fleet of ships and a chest of stories that cemented his reputation. This expedition redefines our view of the Viking world. Here was a future king of Norway who spent his formative years not pillaging monasteries, but serving as a high-ranking officer in the most sophisticated empire since Rome. It proves the Norse could adapt, excel, and rise to the very top in any society they entered. They were not just destroyers of worlds, they could be the elite protectors of one. And as Harald sailed home to eventually claim his throne, other Norse explorers were pushing into a frontier of a completely different kind, one defined not by empires but by absolute emptiness. The world of emperors and mercenaries was one path, but the true engine of Viking expansion was a simpler, more profound hunger, the need for a place to call your own. While Harald Hardrada was forging his legend in Constantinople, a quieter, more monumental exodus was unfolding in the North Atlantic. This was not a raid or a mercenary contract, it was a mass migration, a transplanting of an entire people. Its destination was a land of fire and ice, a volcanic island at the edge of the known world, Iceland. The story begins with a man named Ingolfur Arnarsson. According to the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, Ingolfur and his foster brother Hjörleifur left Norway to escape the rising power of King Harald Fairhair. Harald's campaign to unify all of Norway under one crown was a bloody business, and for many independent-minded chieftains, it meant a stark choice: submit to the king's authority and pay heavy taxes or leave. For men like Ingolfur, freedom was worth a perilous voyage into the unknown. The journey itself was a brutal test. They sailed in Nars, broader, deeper cargo ships than the sleek longships, loaded with everything needed to start a new life: timber, livestock, tools, and seeds. They faced the full fury of the North Atlantic with its sudden gales, dense fogs, and treacherous currents. Navigation was by sun, stars, and the flight patterns of birds, a skill that separated survival from a watery grave. When Ingolfur first sighted Iceland, smoke from volcanic vents stained the horizon, giving the island its name. As his ship drew near the southwestern coast, he performed a pagan ritual to claim his land. He cast his high seat pillars, the carved wooden posts that framed the place of honor in his hall, overboard, vowing to settle wherever the gods brought them ashore. For 3 years he searched the coastline, finally finding the pillars in a place he named Reykjavik, Bay of Smokes, for the steam rising from its hot springs. Here he built his farm, the first permanent Norse settlement around the year 874. Ingolfur's story is the archetype. He was not a conqueror of a populated land, but a pioneer in a wilderness. Iceland was, for all practical purposes, empty. Earlier Irish monks seeking solitude had established small hermitages, but they were gone by the time the Norse arrived. This meant the settlers faced no military opposition, but they also faced no help. Every scrap of food, every shelter, every social structure had to be built from nothing. And what a place to build it! Iceland was a land of breathtaking contradictions, and survival meant learning to read its volatile moods. The interior was a desolate, high-altitude desert of black sand, glaciers, and active volcanoes, utterly inhospitable. But along the coastal fjords, the combination of volcanic soil and the relatively mild maritime climate created pockets of stunning fertility. Grass grew lush for grazing sheep and cattle. Rivers teemed with salmon, and the surrounding seas were an inexhaustible larder of cod and seal. The settlers learned to use the geothermal energy, cooking in hot springs and warming their homes through the long, dark winters. This was not a temporary camp, it was a deliberate, permanent replication of the Scandinavian homestead. Within 60 years, the land nom, the taking of the land, was essentially complete. Every viable valley and fjord had been claimed by a chieftain and his followers. This rapid settlement created something unique, a Norse society with a clean slate. With no king to rule them, they developed the Althing, one of the world's oldest parliamentary assemblies, where free men would meet annually to debate laws and settle disputes. This society, born from a flight from royal authority, became a cradle for an astonishing cultural legacy, the Icelandic sagas. These prose narratives, written centuries later, preserved the history, the feuds, the poetry, and the very identity of the settlers' descendants. But Iceland's role was even greater than its own story. It became the essential stepping stone, the middle ground in a growing Norse Atlantic world. From Iceland, explorers like Erik the Red would push further west, discovering and settling Greenland. And from Greenland, the leap to Vinland became possible. Without the farms and harbors of Iceland as a resupply point, those later, more daring voyages into the absolute unknown might never have happened. Iceland was the proof of concept, the demonstration that a new society could be built across the ocean. It turned the North Atlantic from a terrifying barrier into a Norse highway. And at the far end of that highway, in Greenland, the settlers would face their ultimate test, not against armies, but against the changing heart of the world itself. Iceland proved a society could be built from nothing, but the next expedition would prove the Norse could also take everything. In the year 865, the rules of the game changed forever. No longer content with hit-and-run raids like Lindisfarne, a massive force unlike any seen before landed on the shores of East Anglia. This was not a fleet of raiders, it was an army of conquest. Chroniclers of the time called it the Great Heathen Army, and its leaders were said to be the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, driven by a desire for vengeance and a kingdom of their own. Their arrival marked the moment the Viking Age escalated from seasonal terror to a permanent, existential threat. The scale was staggering. While estimates vary, contemporary sources describe thousands of warriors, a coalition drawn from across Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. They arrived not in a handful of longships, but in a vast armada, a floating city of soldiers, horses, and siege equipment. They came to stay. Their first move was one of chilling pragmatism. In East Anglia, they secured horses, transforming themselves from coastal raiders into a highly mobile cavalry force capable of striking deep into the English heartland. With their mobility secured, they turned their sights north to the crown jewel of Anglo-Saxon Northumbria, the city of York. York was not just a city, it was a symbol of power, wealth, and Christian faith. The Great Heathen Army descended upon it in late 866, exploiting a bitter civil war between two rival Northumbrian kings. The Vikings did not just attack the city, they mastered it. They laid a sophisticated siege, broke through the defenses, and poured into the streets. The fighting was fierce, but the Norse prevailed. Both rival kings were killed in the aftermath. But here, the sons of Ragnar revealed a new strategy. Instead of looting York and burning it to the ground, they did something far more clever. They installed a puppet king, a compliant English noble named Egbert, to rule Northumbria on their behalf. They would collect the taxes and wield the real power from the shadows. York, or Jorvik as they called it, became the capital of a new Viking kingdom in England. For over a decade, the Great Heathen Army marched, fought, and negotiated its way across England. They used terror as a weapon, but also shrewd politics. They would defeat a kingdom, extract a massive payment of silver called Danelaw in exchange for peace, only to break the treaty and attack again when the money ran out. They besieged and captured the royal fortress of Nottingham. They fought the kingdom of Mercia to a standstill. They even turned on their first hosts, conquering East Anglia and brutally executing its king, Edmund, who would later be canonized as Saint Edmund the Martyr. The entire political map of England was being redrawn in blood and silver. The ultimate outcome of this year's long campaign was the Danelaw. Following a decisive victory by the Viking forces in 877, the Treaty of Wedmore was forged with Alfred the Great of Wessex. This agreement formally partitioned England. The eastern and northern half of the country, encompassing Northumbria, East Anglia, and much of Mercia, became the Danelaw, a vast territory where Danish law and custom held sway. Norse settlers flooded in, establishing farms, market towns, and a thriving trade hub at York. The cultural impact was deep and lasting. Place names ending in by, Thorpe, and Kirk dot the map of eastern England to this day, linguistic fossils of Viking settlement. The English language itself absorbed hundreds of Old Norse words, from simple ones like sky and egg to fundamental concepts like law and husband. This expedition represents the zenith of Viking military and political power. It was no longer about portable wealth. It was about territory, sovereignty, and building a new homeland on conquered soil. The great heathen army transformed the Norse from pirates into kings and landowners, leaving a legacy etched not just in chronicles but in the very soil and speech of England. Yet, even as one brotherhood carved out a kingdom in the green fields of Britain, another was being drawn toward a far more elusive prize, one that shimmered not on land, but in the distant, empty expanse of the Western Sea. While one army was forging a kingdom in England, another kind of expedition was unfolding far to the east, in a vast landscape of forests and rivers. The Slavic and Finnic tribes living along the Volkhov and Dnieper rivers were locked in cycles of internal strife. According to the ancient primary chronicle, they reached a pivotal decision. They said to themselves, "Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law." And so they sent word across the Baltic Sea to the Varangian Rus, a group of Scandinavian traders and warriors. Their message was simple: "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come reign as princes over us." The man who answered this call, according to legend, was a chieftain named Rurik. Around the year 862, he arrived with his brothers Cineas and Truva and a band of loyal followers. He established his seat of power at Novgorod, a strategic hub on the trade routes. This is the founding myth of the Kievan Rus, the precursor state to modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. But how much of this is a peaceful invitation, and how much is a convenient story written by the victors? The truth likely lies somewhere between diplomacy and domination. It is improbable that scattered tribes unanimously invited a foreign warlord to rule them. A more plausible scenario is that Viking bands, the Varangians, were already active in the region, controlling key portages and trading posts. They were a disruptive force, perhaps extracting tribute through threat. Their invitation in the chronicle may symbolize a moment when the local elites, tired of the chaos, decided to formally co-opt the strongest of these outsiders, granting Rurik legitimacy in exchange for stability and protection from other raiders. It was less a request and more a pragmatic merger. Rurik and his successors did not come as colonizers seeking empty land, but as networkers seeking profit. Their genius was mastering the geography. They used their superior shipbuilding to navigate the complex river highways, the Dnieper flowing south to the Black Sea and the Volga winding southeast to the Caspian. These were the Silk Roads of the north. At key points, they built fortified settlements or gorads to control the flow of goods. They would portage their ships between river systems, dragging them on logs across watersheds, a back-breaking but essential task. From the northern forests, they gathered luxury goods coveted by distant empires: amber, furs, honey, and wax. They also captured slaves. These commodities were loaded onto their ships for the long, dangerous journey south. One route led down the Dnieper past the fierce nomadic Pechenegs of the steppe to the Black Sea and the magnificent walls of Constantinople, or Miklagard, the great city as the Norse called it. The other followed the Volga to the Caspian Sea and the wealthy markets of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. In exchange, they returned north with silk, spices, wine, and most importantly, silver. Hordes of Arabic dirham coins found from Sweden to Novgorod trace these lucrative routes like a monetary map. Over generations, Rurik's descendants did not remain Scandinavian outsiders. They intermarried with the Slavic elite, adopted local customs and language, and their settlements evolved from trading posts into powerful city-states, most notably Kiev. The ruling class became Slavicized, but the name they gave to their new realm, Rus, echoed their Viking origins. This fusion created a unique civilization that would become the crucible of Eastern Orthodox Christianity and the foundation of Russian identity. The expedition of Rurik was not a raid, but a slow, strategic takeover of an economic system. It shows the Vikings as state builders, not just destroyers, whose legacy would shape the destiny of continents for 1,000 years. And as some Norse carved out river empires, others were drawn to a destination that promised not silver, but a truth beyond the mortal world. The world of rivers and empires was built on trade, but one of the most valuable Viking commodities came from the very top of the world. While some sought kingdoms, a chieftain named Other sought something else, the precise limits of the land itself. He lived in the far north of Norway, in a place called Helgoland, where the summer sun never truly set and the winter was a long, dark silence. His home was already on the edge of the map, but Other looked further north into the unknown. His story survives not in sagas, but in a remarkable historical accident, a report he gave to perhaps the most learned king in Europe, Alfred the Great of Wessex. Around the year 890, Other visited Alfred's court, and the king, fascinated by geography, had his scribes record the Norse chieftain's account. This gives us a first-hand glimpse into a mind driven not by conquest, but by pure, practical curiosity. Other told the king he wished to find out how far the land extended to the north and whether anyone lived beyond the empty coast. He loaded his ship with essential trade goods and set sail from his home fjord. For days, he kept the barren, mountainous coast of Norway to his starboard side, sailing ever northward. He passed the territory of the Norse, then the lands of the Sami, whom he called the Finners, who were hunters and reindeer herders. Finally, after a voyage of several days, he reached a place where the coast turned sharply east. He had rounded the North Cape, the northernmost point of continental Europe, a landmark of terrifying beauty where the Arctic Ocean meets the Norwegian Sea. No European had ever documented sailing this far before. He was now in uncharted waters. Turning east, he sailed for several more days along a desolate, low-lying coast. This was the shore of the Kola Peninsula, leading into the frigid embrace of the White Sea. The environment was harsh and alien, but Other was a keen observer of its economy. He noted the immense wealth of the region, not in silver but in natural resources. The seas teemed with walrus, whose long, spiraled tusks were more valuable than elephant ivory in European markets. The land was rich with fur-bearing animals, and the Sami hunters paid tribute to chieftains like Other in pelts and walrus hide ropes. His expedition had a clear commercial motive to scout new sources for these luxury goods. After his long eastern sail, Other finally encountered people. He met the Bjarmians, a tribe likely of Finnic origin, settled near the mouth of a great river, probably the northern Davina. He was cautious, anchoring his ship some distance from their settlement and going ashore alone to investigate. He observed their community and their farming practices, but he did not seek conflict. His mission was reconnaissance. He learned enough to understand this was a distinct culture with its own language and customs, living at the very edge of the habitable world. Having satisfied his curiosity and assessed the trading potential, he turned for home. The return voyage was even more daring, for he chose to sail south across the open sea from the North Cape directly to the trading port of Skiringsel, a journey that took 5 days out of sight of land, a testament to his supreme confidence in open ocean navigation. Other's report to King Alfred is a quiet masterpiece of early exploration. It contains no tales of battle or plunder. Instead, it is filled with careful details, sailing times, descriptions of wildlife, and observations of the midnight sun. He measured his wealth for the king not in coined silver, but in the number of reindeer he owned and the tribute in furs he received. This expedition redefines the Viking spirit. Here was a man who risked the Arctic ice and unknown shores not for glory or territory, but to answer a simple, profound question: what is out there? He mapped the world with his keel and his ledger, blending geographic curiosity with sharp economic sense. His voyage opened the Arctic as a commercial frontier, a highway for walrus ivory that would connect the frozen north to the courts of Europe for centuries. And it proves that the Norse drive to explore was as much about understanding the world as it was about claiming it. The Arctic's silent wealth was one thing, but the true measure of Viking ambition was taken in the echoing halls of kings. In the spring of 845, a fleet of 120 longships appeared on the Seine River, a wooden armada carrying thousands of warriors deep into the heart of the Frankish Empire. Their target was not a remote monastery, but Paris itself, the seat of the West Frankish king, Charles the Bald. At the helm of this unprecedented force was a chieftain whose name would become legend, Ragnar, possibly the very figure known in sagas as Ragnar Lothbrok. This was no longer a raid on the periphery, it was a direct assault on the center of European power. The journey up the Seine was a calculated display of terror. The fleet moved with ominous purpose, pausing to sack and burn every undefended town and religious house along the riverbanks. The message to the king in Paris was unmistakable: nothing could stop their advance. As they neared the city, the Franks prepared a defense, splitting their army to guard both banks of the Seine. Ragnar, a master of psychological warfare, chose his moment. He attacked and overwhelmed the smaller Frankish force on one bank. Then, in a gesture of pure, brutal theater, he had over 100 prisoners publicly hanged on an island within sight of the remaining defenders on the opposite shore. This act of calculated cruelty shattered Frankish morale. Paris itself, in the 9th century, was not the sprawling metropolis of later ages. It was concentrated on the Isle de la Cité, a fortified island in the middle of the Seine. The Vikings laid siege to this island stronghold. While they may not have breached the innermost walls, they captured and plundered the abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés and other suburbs, demonstrating their ability to strangle the city at will. King Charles the Bald, his army demoralized and unable to dislodge the invaders, faced an impossible choice. He could not defeat them in battle, and a prolonged siege would destroy his capital. So he chose the path of pragmatism over pride. He offered a deal. The price for peace was a fortune. King Charles agreed to pay the Vikings a Danegeld of 7,000 pounds of pure silver. In return, Ragnar and his army pledged to lift the siege and leave the kingdom. The Vikings accepted the payment, loaded their ships with Frankish treasure, and sailed back down the Seine. On the surface, it was a victory for the Franks. They had saved Paris without a catastrophic battle. But in reality, Ragnar had won something far more valuable than silver. He had proven a devastating formula to every ambitious leader in Scandinavia. A show of overwhelming force directed at the very heart of a kingdom could yield a king's ransom in pure bullion paid by the king himself. The precedent set in 845 was catastrophic for Europe. The siege of Paris was not an end but a blueprint. For the next century and a half, Viking fleets would return to the Seine, the Loire, and every other navigable river in Francia, each time demanding larger and larger payments. The Danegeld became a toxic, institutionalized tax on fear. It drained treasuries, encouraged more raids, and revealed the fragility of even the greatest Carolingian empires. The Vikings had learned they could extort kingdoms as easily as they could plunder monasteries, and that lesson would echo in the demands of every chieftain who followed Ragnar's wake. Yet, even as this cycle of payment and predation tightened its grip on Europe, other Norse explorers were looking beyond the continent entirely, toward a land where the sun burned hotter and the sands held a different kind of treasure. Ragnar's siege of Paris proved the power of a fleet, but true exploration often demanded the courage of a single ship sailing into the unknown. This brings us to Gardar Svavarson, a Swedish-born Viking whose accidental discovery would become the cornerstone of the North Atlantic world. His story begins with a familiar pattern, a voyage from Scandinavia to claim an inheritance in the Hebrides, but the North Atlantic had other plans. A ferocious storm seized his ship, driving it far off course into a vast, empty sea. When the winds finally calmed, a new coastline rose from the mist, a land of stark green fjords, smoking volcanoes, and towering glaciers. Gardar had found Iceland, but he did not yet know what it was. Was this a peninsula of a greater continent or an island unto itself? He made landfall in a northern fjord, likely near modern-day Husavik. With winter closing in, he and his crew had no choice but to stay. They built a house, a simple structure of turf and timber, and settled in to wait out the long, dark months. This was not a raid or a trading mission. It was an unplanned test of survival in a pristine wilderness. They fished the rich waters, hunted what game they could find, and explored their immediate surroundings. When spring finally arrived, Gardar faced a critical decision. He could simply turn his ship east and try to find his way back to familiar waters, but he chose a different path, one that speaks to the meticulous mind of a true explorer. He decided to sail around this entire landmass. For weeks, he guided his ship along the treacherous coastline, past sheer cliffs and sweeping black sand beaches, through narrow fjords and around jagged peninsulas. He was mapping the island with his keel, committing its shape to memory. He completed the full circuit, proving beyond doubt that this was an island surrounded by the boundless ocean. He gave it a name, Gardarshom, Gardar's Island. This act of deliberate circumnavigation is a quiet masterpiece of early cartography. It transformed an accidental landfall into a defined, knowable place. Gardar did not just discover Iceland, he defined its geographic reality. This precise, systematic approach to navigation was the hidden engine of Viking expansion. Before setting out on any long voyage, they gathered every scrap of information, from sailors' tales like Bjarni Herjolfsson's to the detailed coastal knowledge gained from journeys like Gardar's. They used simple but effective tools, a sun compass to find their latitude, and a deep understanding of currents, bird flight patterns, and the color of the sea. Gardar's circumnavigation provided the first reliable chart for every settler who followed. When Ingolfur Arnarsson later cast his high-seat pillars overboard, he was sailing toward a place that was already on the Norse mental map thanks to Gardar. This expedition highlights a crucial truth. The Vikings were not just daring adventurers, they were meticulous planners. Their success across thousands of miles of open ocean depended on turning the unknown into the known, one careful coastline at a time. Gardar's island was no longer a mystery, it was a destination, and that clarity would soon draw thousands to its shores, creating a society that would itself become a launching point for journeys even further into the great Western Ocean. The silver that flowed through the rivers of the Rus was not an end but a beginning. For the most ambitious traders, the Volga was a liquid highway pointing southeast, a shimmering path that led to the very source of that wealth, the Islamic Caliphate itself. This journey was the ultimate commercial expedition, a months-long voyage from the Baltic forests to the deserts of the Caspian Sea. The men who made it were not just merchants, they were pioneers on a frontier of culture and conflict, and their story is written in thousands of silver coins scattered across Scandinavia. The route was a brutal test of endurance and diplomacy. After gathering their cargo of furs, amber, and slaves in the northern trading towns, the Rus loaded their shallow draft boats. They would sail down the Volga, but the journey was not continuous. At certain points, the river grew too shallow or turned in the wrong direction. Here, they faced the back-breaking work of the portage. They would unload every precious bale and human captive, then physically drag their vessels over log rollers across miles of land to reach the next navigable waterway. This made them vulnerable, moving slowly through territories controlled by various tribes, and most significantly, the Khazar Khaganate. The Khazars were a major power, a Turkic empire that controlled the strategic gateway between the Black Sea and the Caspian. Their capital, Itil, sat astride the Volga Delta. For the Rus, the Khazars were both toll collectors and potential adversaries. To pass through to the rich markets of the south, the Vikings often had to pay a heavy tax in goods, sometimes as much as half their cargo. This constant negotiation could easily tip into violence. The Rus, armed and desperate to protect their profits, and the Khazars, determined to control their border, clashed repeatedly. It was a tense, fragile relationship where trade and raid were two sides of the same coin. If a crew successfully navigated these hazards and reached the Caspian Sea, a new world opened before them. They had entered the domain of the Abbasid Caliphate, a civilization of immense sophistication and wealth. The Rus sought specific ports, cities like Baku, with its famous eternal fires, or Derbent, with its colossal wall blocking the mountain passes. Here in bustling, sun-baked bazaars, they traded their northern goods for the luxuries of the south. Silks so fine they felt like air, intricate glassware, spices, and above all, silver. The primary currency of the Abbasids was the dirham, a high-purity silver coin. The Vikings had no use for the Arabic inscriptions. They valued the coins solely for their weight and metal. They would melt them down for jewelry or simply hoard them as raw bullion. But commerce could quickly turn to conquest. The sagas and Arab chronicles tell of times when the Rus, perhaps dissatisfied with prices or simply seeing an undefended port, switched from merchants to raiders. In the 10th century, a large Rus fleet sailed into the Caspian and launched devastating attacks on its southern shores. They struck at Baku and other cities in what is now Azerbaijan, showing a terrifying amphibious skill. An Arab historian, Ibn Miskawayh, described one such raid with awe and horror. He wrote of the Rus as tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy, wearing no mail but fighting with ferocious, almost reckless courage. They would loot a city, then retreat to an island base, living off their plunder before sailing off again. These raids sent shockwaves through the Islamic world, proving that the long arm of the north could reach even the caliph's doorstep. The legacy of these Volga voyages is measured in treasure. Thousands upon thousands of Abbasid dirhams have been found in hoards buried across Sweden, Denmark, and the Baltic lands. This silver was the lifeblood of the Viking Age economy, financing everything from a king's army to a farmer's new plow. It connected the pine forests of the north to the palaces of Baghdad in a single, staggering economic circuit. This expedition reveals the Norse not as mindless plunderers, but as calculated, long-distance operators who understood global markets 1,000 years before the word globalization was ever spoken. They braved deserts, mountains, and hostile empires, all for the gleam of silver, weaving a thread of commerce that stitched together two vastly different worlds. Silver connected continents, but the most audacious real estate venture in history began with a crime of passion. Erik Thorvaldsson, known to history as Erik the Red, was a man whose temper was as fiery as his hair. In the close-knit society of Iceland, a feud over a set of ornate bench boards escalated into violence. Erik killed 2 men and was declared an outlaw, banished from Iceland for 3 years. With nowhere to go but the open ocean, he turned his exile into an opportunity. He had heard tales from a kinsman of a land sighted far to the west, a massive, glacier-crowned coast glimpsed through the mist. With nothing to lose, Erik gathered a crew and set his prow toward that rumor. What he found was a land of heartbreaking duality. The interior was a crushing, miles-thick dome of ice, but along the southwestern fjords, he discovered deep, sheltered inlets where the summer sun coaxed green grass from the valleys. Here, a man could raise sheep and cattle. He spent his 3 years of exile exploring this harsh new world, meticulously mapping the best harbors and pastures. When his sentence was up, he returned to Iceland with a plan, not just to settle but to sell. He needed people, and to get them, he crafted one of history's most brilliant pieces of misleading advertising. He called this frozen frontier Greenland. In his pitch to potential settlers, he argued that people would be more eager to go to a place with an attractive name. It was a masterstroke. The promise of Greenland, of a fresh start beyond the reach of Icelandic law and crowded valleys, proved irresistible. Around the year 985, he led a fleet of 25 ships filled with hopeful families, their livestock, and all their worldly goods on the perilous journey west. Only 14 ships completed the crossing, but those that did laid the foundation of a new Norse society at the very edge of the world. They established 2 main clusters of farms, known as the Eastern Settlement, around modern-day Qaqortoq, and the smaller Western Settlement, farther up the coast near Nuuk. Life in Greenland was a constant negotiation with extremity. The growing season was short, and grain cultivation was nearly impossible. Their economy became a precarious hybrid, a mix of pastoral farming and high-stakes hunting. They raised sheep for wool, a crucial export, and cattle for dairy. But survival depended on the summer hunts far to the north, in the region they called the Norðursetur. Men would voyage for weeks to Disco Bay, where they hunted walrus for their ivory and hide, and narwhal for their spiraled tusks, which were sold in Europe as unicorn horns. Seal hunting provided essential meat and oil for lamps through the long, sunless winters. This was not a life of abundance, but one of careful balance. Yet for nearly 500 years, the Norse Greenlanders clung to their way of life. They built stone churches like the cathedral at Gardar and paid tithes to the church in Norway. They remained steadfastly European in dress, faith, and custom, even as their world grew increasingly isolated. Greenland's true historical significance, however, lies in its geography. It was the essential stepping stone, the final outpost before the absolute unknown. Without the farms and harbors of Greenland as a resupply point, the leap across the Davis straight to the forests of Markland and Vinland would have been unimaginable. When Leif Erikson, Erik's own son, mounted his expedition to the west, he sailed from Greenland. The colony was not just a home, it was a launch pad for the first European footsteps in America. And then it vanished. By the middle of the 15th century, the Norse settlements in Greenland were silent. The last recorded ship to visit the Western settlement in the 1340s found only empty farms and wandering livestock. What happened to them is one of the Arctic's greatest mysteries. Did a cooling climate, the Little Ice Age, shorten growing seasons and extend sea ice, cutting off trade and hunting grounds? Did conflict with the advancing Thule culture, the ancestors of the Inuit who were far better adapted to the Arctic environment, lead to their downfall? Or did a combination of economic collapse, cultural isolation, and a simple refusal to adapt their European lifestyle finally doom them? The empty stone foundations of Brattahlid, Erik the Red's own estate, stand as a stark monument to a bold experiment that ultimately could not bend with the changing world. 5 centuries after the great heathen army carved out the Danelaw, a single, final throw of the dice would decide if England would remain a Viking kingdom. The year was 1066, and the man making the gamble was the legendary Harald Hardrada, now King of Norway. His claim to the English throne was audacious, based on a forgotten pact between a long-dead Danish king and his own predecessor. But ambition found a willing ally in Tostig Godwinson, the exiled and vengeful brother of England's new king, Harold. Together, they assembled a mighty invasion force, perhaps 300 ships carrying nearly 10,000 of Scandinavia's finest warriors. This was not a raid, it was a full-scale conquest meant to reclaim the north for the Norse once and for all. They landed in the north, in the old Viking heartland of Yorkshire, and their first move was a masterstroke. King Harold's English army was far to the south, watching the coast for another invader, William of Normandy. The northern English earls, Edwin and Morcar, marched out to meet Hardrada at Fulford, just outside York. The battle was a brutal, close-fought affair in a boggy landscape. Hardrada, using his decades of Byzantine military experience, lured the English into a trap, feigning a retreat before his disciplined shield wall turned and crushed them. The road to York, and perhaps to all of England, lay open. Victorious, Hardrada and Tostig took hostages and supplies from the city, then withdrew to their camp at Stamford Bridge, a crossing over the River Derwent about 8 miles east. They expected to formalize their surrender terms in a few days. The mood in the Viking camp was one of triumphant relaxation. Many warriors had left their heavy chainmail by the ships, believing the fighting was over. They basked in the late September sun, confident and unprepared. They had not accounted for the speed of King Harold Godwinson. The moment he learned of the invasion in the north, he made one of the most decisive moves in military history. He marched his entire housecarl army, the elite professional corps of his forces, from London to York in just 4 days, covering almost 200 miles. It was a staggering feat of endurance and will. On September the 25th, the unsuspecting Viking army at Stamford Bridge saw a dust cloud on the western horizon that soon resolved into the glint of spear points and the dreaded dragon standard of Wessex. Harold's army had arrived, and they were not coming to negotiate. The battle that followed was the stuff of saga. According to legend, a single, giant Norse berserker held the narrow bridge against the entire English vanguard, hewing down dozens of men with a great axe until an English soldier floated underneath the bridge in a barrel and thrust a spear up through the planks to kill him. Whether this precise tale is true, it captures the desperate, heroic last stand that ensued. The main Viking force, caught off guard and without their armor, scrambled to form a shield wall on the far side of the river. The battle raged for hours, a brutal slog of axe and sword under the autumn sun. Hardrada, in the thick of the fighting, fought like a man possessed, but a stray arrow found his throat, felling the last great Viking king. Tostig took up the banner and fought on until he too was cut down. The Norse line finally broke. Of the 300 ships that had sailed, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. Stamford Bridge was more than a military defeat, it was an epoch-ending event. It shattered the dream of a new Norse England. The Viking Age, which had begun with the shock of Lindisfarne, effectively ended on that bridge over the Derwent. The cost, however, was catastrophic for England. King Harold's magnificent, exhausted army had no time to rest or regroup. Just 3 days later, William the Conqueror landed in the south. Harold had to turn his men around and march them another 250 miles to meet this new, fresh enemy at Hastings. The men who stood on Senlac Hill were the battered survivors of Stamford Bridge, and their fatigue likely contributed to the Norman victory that changed England forever. Hardrada's final expedition, in its spectacular failure, had inadvertently paved the way for a very different kind of conquest. The thunder of Stamford Bridge had scarcely faded when, 2 centuries earlier, a different kind of ambition was sailing toward the Mediterranean sun. While most Viking fleets haunted the familiar coasts of the North Sea, a chieftain named Haystein dreamed in a different color, the deep blue of the Middle Sea. His expedition, alongside the famed Björn Ironside, would become the stuff of legend, a 3-year voyage that stretched Norse reach to its absolute geographical limit. They aimed not for the cloudy shores of England, but for the legendary cities at the very heart of the old Roman world. Their journey was a masterclass in audacious navigation. To reach the Mediterranean, they had to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar, a choke point guarded by both geography and the powerful Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba. This was no open ocean crossing, it was a gauntlet. Contemporary Arab chronicles describe the Norse fleet, perhaps as many as 62 ships, battling their way past the strait, fighting against both currents and defending Muslim fleets. It was a costly passage, but they broke through, spilling into a sea whose warmth and wealth must have seemed unimaginable. They had entered a new world. For 3 years, this Viking fleet became a mobile, predatory force along the southern European and North African coasts. They raided the Spanish coastline from Algeciras to the Balearic Islands. They crossed to the coast of Morocco, striking at Necker. They sailed up the eastern coast of Spain into what is now France, raiding as far as the Rhone Delta. They were opportunists on a grand scale, attacking undefended monasteries and towns, gathering loot and slaves, and living off the land and sea. But their ultimate goal, whispered in the sagas, was the greatest prize of all, Rome itself. This ambition led to one of the most famous and likely fictional tales of Viking cunning, the raid on Luna. According to the story, Haystein and his fleet arrived at the walls of a beautiful Italian city they believed was Rome. Seeing its formidable defenses, Haystein knew a direct assault was impossible, so he devised a ruse of breathtaking theatricality. He sent messengers to the city gates announcing that their great chieftain lay dying, and that on his deathbed he had experienced a vision. He wished to be baptized a Christian and buried in consecrated ground within their holy city. The local bishop, moved by this story of a deathbed conversion, granted the request. The Vikings carried a covered litter through the gates, bearing what appeared to be their pallid, sick leader. They proceeded to the church for the funeral rites. At the climactic moment, Haystein, the supposedly dead chieftain, sprang from the litter, seized the bishop as a hostage, and threw open the city gates to his waiting warriors. The city was sacked. Only later, the story goes, did Haystein learn this was not Rome, but the smaller city of Luna. The tale is almost certainly a later invention, a saga writer's flourish, but its power lies in the underlying truth it represents. It captures the sheer, daring ambition of the expedition, the willingness to use any trick to penetrate the heartlands of Christendom. Whether they raided Luna or not, the historical record confirms the fleet's staggering reach. They reportedly wintered in the Camargue region of France and even sailed into the Ligurian Sea, possibly threatening Pisa. By the time they turned for home in 862, they were laden with Mediterranean riches, silks, silver, and spices. Their return journey was another trial, fighting their way back through the Strait of Gibraltar and weathering a great storm that scattered their fleet off the coast of Spain. Only a handful of ships made it back to their starting point in the Loire estuary. Haystein's 3-year odyssey stands as a pinnacle of Viking range and ambition. It proved that no corner of Europe was safe from the reach of the longships. They had navigated from the foggy fjords to the sun-baked coasts of Africa, a journey that connected the northern and southern worlds in a circuit of plunder. It was a feat that would not be repeated on such a scale, a final, spectacular reach before the age of the great raids began to wane. While Haystein's fleet chased Mediterranean sun, a quieter, colder current of Norse ambition was flowing east. Along the forested riverbanks of what is now Russia, the Vikings were not just visiting, they were putting down roots. Two of the most critical were Staraya Ladoga and Novgorod, settlements that reveal the true engine of the eastern expansion trade. Staraya Ladoga, founded in the mid-8th century, was the first major node. It sat on the Volkhov River, a strategic choke point on the route from the Baltic Sea to the interior. This was not a colony of farmers, but a cosmopolitan trading factory. The archaeological layers tell a vivid story of a bustling, multi-ethnic hub. Digging through the soil, archaeologists find Norse brooches and spearheads lying beside Slavic pottery, Baltic amber beads, and even fragments of Arabic silver dirhams. They have uncovered the tools of many crafts, from blacksmiths' forges to jewelers' workshops, and the remains of long, narrow buildings with the distinctive bowed walls of Scandinavian hall design. Most telling are the small, personal finds, like a wooden distaff used for spinning thread, inscribed with the Norse name Sigrid in runes. This was a place where people from across the north lived, worked, and died together, a frontier melting pot where culture and goods were constantly exchanged. The purpose of these settlements was to control the flow of luxury. Furs from the northern forests, honey, wax, and slaves were gathered here, loaded onto shallow draft boats, and sent south down the river highways toward Constantinople and Baghdad. In return, the silver, silk, and spices flowed back north. To protect this lucrative pipeline, the settlements were heavily fortified. Starea Ladoga was guarded by an earth and timber rampart, a clear sign that wealth attracted danger and that its inhabitants were prepared to defend their stake. Over time, as the trade grew more organized and the resident Norse chieftains grew more powerful, the center of gravity shifted. Deeper inland along the Volkhov, a new and more imposing settlement rose, Novgorod, which literally means new fort. This was not just a trading post, it was becoming a political capital. According to the chronicles, it was here that the Viking chieftain Rurik was invited to bring order in the 9th century, establishing a ruling dynasty. The archaeology supports this evolution, showing a sprawling, planned town with defined districts for craftsmen, merchants, and nobles, and evidence of a sophisticated wooden road system. The story of Starea Ladoga and Novgorod is the story of the Viking Age maturing. It shows the seamless shift from mobile bands seeking plunder to entrenched elites building a system. They started as armed merchants guarding a portage, and within a few generations they were the princes of a vast river network, laying the administrative groundwork for the state of Kievan Rus. This was exploration with a permanent address, a journey that ended not in a ship's hold full of silver, but in a throne hall built on the banks of a Russian river. Far to the north, beyond even the hunting grounds of the Norðursetur, the maps of the medieval world simply faded into white. Yet the Norse had a name for a place that may have existed only in the whispers of sailors, Svalbardi, the cold coast. This is not a saga of settlement or battle, but a ghost of an expedition, a possibility that lingers in the frozen air. Old Norse texts like the 14th century Icelandic chronicle, the Landnámabók, mention Svalbardi in passing, listing it as a territory lying 4 days' sail north of Iceland. Another source speaks of finding ice mountains to the north of Greenland. These are not detailed travel logs, but fleeting references, clues dropped by storytellers who may have been recounting second-hand tales from hunters who ventured farther than anyone thought possible. The description is hauntingly accurate for the Arctic archipelago we now call Svalbard, a land of dramatic glaciers, barren mountains, and a coastline that truly earns the name Cold Coast. The timing is plausible. Norse hunters from Greenland routinely sailed far up the western coast in search of walrus, pushing into the Davis Strait and perhaps even glimpsing the eastern edges of the Canadian Arctic. Could a ship driven by a storm or simply extraordinary curiosity have continued east across the Greenland Sea? Their Nars, with their sturdy, deep hulls, were certainly capable of such a voyage in the summer months. They possessed the navigational skill to maintain a course and the sheer toughness to survive in those waters. Imagine such a crew after days of sailing through fog and floating ice, seeing a new, jagged line of peaks materialize on the horizon. They would have found a land devoid of any human presence, but rich with the very resources they sought: polar bear, seal, and surely vast herds of walrus resting on the icy shores. It would have been a hunter's paradise and a discoverer's ultimate prize. Yet here the story dissolves. Despite decades of searching, archaeologists have found no definitive proof, no Norse artifacts, no stone shelters, no bronze pins lost in the tundra. The silence of Svalbard's ground is absolute. This absence forces a difficult question. Does it mean they never arrived, or does it mean that a single voyage, a brief landing for fresh water and a scouting of the beaches, left no trace that has survived 1,000 Arctic winters? A discovery does not require a settlement, only a sighting. The possibility remains suspended between the lines of old texts and the empty, windswept shores. It is a testament to the Norse horizon, which seemed to stretch infinitely into the cold blue north. Whether Svalbard was a real coordinate on their mental charts or just a legend born from icebergs and sailors' yarns, the very fact that we can debate it centuries later speaks to the scale of their unknown journeys. For every Vinland they carved into history, there may have been a dozen Svalbardis, glimpsed and then lost again to the mist, their stories fading until only the cold coast remains, a name waiting for its explorers to return. But the most prestigious expedition of all required no ship of your own, only a strong arm and a willingness to swear an oath to a foreign god. In the heart of Constantinople, the greatest city in Christendom, the emperor's personal security was entrusted to a corps of outsiders, the Varangian Guard. For more than 3 centuries, this elite unit was dominated first by Scandinavians and later by Anglo-Saxons, men who turned military service into a lucrative, globe-spanning career. Recruitment was a pull of legendary proportions. Young warriors from the fjords or the downs of England, often younger sons with little inheritance, would hear tales of the Miklagard, the great city, where the streets were paved with marble and the emperor paid his guards in gold and silk. The journey east was itself an epic, traveling the river roads of the Rus or sailing the Mediterranean, a test that filtered for only the most determined. Upon arrival, they entered a world of unimaginable splendor. The Hagia Sophia, with its dome that seemed to hang from heaven by a golden chain, would have dwarfed any mead hall they had ever known. Their loyalty was their defining trait. As foreigners with no local ties or political ambitions, they were considered uniquely trustworthy by the Byzantine emperors, who were often surrounded by conspiracies. Their weapon of choice cemented their fearsome reputation, the massive two-handed Danish axe. In the tight confines of a palace corridor or on the battlefield, these axes could cleave through armor, horses, and shield walls with terrifying efficiency. They were the emperor's ultimate insurance policy. Their service took them to the farthest corners of the empire. Varangians stood guard in the sun-baked hills of Syria, campaigned against Arab emirates in Sicily, and fought in the rugged mountains of Bulgaria. They were the firemen of Byzantium, deployed to wherever the empire faced its most severe crises. The wealth they earned was monumental. A successful tour of duty meant a man could return home with enough treasure to buy a lordship, his chests filled with Byzantine gold coins, silks, and relics. The most famous Varangian of all was the Norwegian prince Harald Hardrada, who served with distinction for nearly a decade before using his fortune to fund his bid for a throne. But lesser-known men left their marks in quieter ways. High in the galleries of the Hagia Sophia, a faint runic inscription is carved into the marble railing. It reads, "Halfdan carved these runes." It is a simple, human moment frozen in time, a homesick warrior from the north leaving his name in the heart of an alien, breathtaking world, connecting the land of ice and Soga to the capital of empire with a few strokes of a knife. The Varangian Guard was the ultimate Viking expedition, one that traded the uncertainty of exploration for the structured glory of imperial service, proving that the Norse could thrive not just on the edges of maps, but at the very center of power. The Varangian Guard proved the Norse could master the politics of empire, but other fleets tested their luck against a different kind of power. In the year 844, a Viking force of perhaps 80 ships appeared off the coast of what is now Portugal. Their target was not the familiar shores of Francia or England, but the sun-drenched lands of the Iberian Peninsula, a territory under the control of the powerful Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba. This was a deliberate probe into the domain of a sophisticated Islamic state, and it would become a brutal lesson in overreach. The fleet moved with swift, predatory intent. They first sacked Lisbon, a city under Muslim control, taking plunder and likely prisoners. They continued south, raiding the port of Cadiz before turning their attention inland. They found a river highway, the Guadalquivir, and sailed up its winding course deep into the heart of Al-Andalus. Their ultimate prize was the city of Seville, a major administrative and commercial center. The city's defenses were unprepared for an attack from the river. The Vikings stormed ashore, overwhelming the local garrison. They looted the city thoroughly and, according to Arab chroniclers, held it for about a month, using it as a base for further raids into the surrounding countryside. They treated Seville not as a place to sack and flee, but as a conquered territory to be exploited. This was a level of ambition the Umayyads could not tolerate. The emir, Abd al-Rahman II, responded with a speed and fury that the Vikings had rarely encountered in the fractured kingdoms of the north. He mobilized his armies, a professional force of cavalry and infantry, and crucially, he deployed a powerful navy. The Muslim fleet moved to block the mouth of the Guadalquivir, cutting off the Viking escape route. On land, the emir's troops engaged the Norse raiders in a series of pitched battles. The fighting was fierce. The Vikings, used to fighting shield walls against infantry, now faced disciplined cavalry charges and skilled archers. They were outmaneuvered and outfought. Many were killed in the fighting. A significant number, perhaps hundreds, were captured alive. The emir's justice was swift and severe. In a public display meant to deter any future incursions, the captives were executed, some by crucifixion in the palm groves of Seville. The surviving Vikings, their fleet battered and their force decimated, managed to fight their way back down the river and escape to sea. The raid on Seville was a tactical success but a strategic disaster. It showed the absolute limits of Viking power when facing a centralized, militarily organized state. The Umayyads possessed the resources to raise large armies, a dedicated navy to control their coasts, and the political will to deliver a crushing, definitive response. This was not a kingdom that would pay Danegeld, it was an empire that would exterminate the threat. The expedition served as a stark warning, one that would resonate for decades. While Norse ships would continue to harass the Atlantic coasts of Iberia, they never again attempted a deep, sustained invasion into the heartland of Al-Andalus. The palm trees of Seville, where Norse captives met their end, marked the southern boundary of Viking conquest. Seville's palm trees marked a southern limit, but in the frozen north, an entire society was reaching its own final boundary. The Norse colonies in Greenland did not fall in a single, dramatic battle. Their end was a slow fading, a quiet extinguishing of light in one of the world's most extreme environments. For nearly 500 years, these settlers had clung to their European way of life at the edge of the Arctic, but by the middle of the 15th century, the eastern and western settlements were completely abandoned, leaving only stone ruins to tell their tale. What happened to them is not a story of one expedition, but the haunting epilogue to a centuries-long experiment. The decline began in the 1300s, a century of mounting pressures. The first and most relentless was the climate. The relatively mild medieval warm period that had welcomed Erik the Red was ending, giving way to the creeping advance of the Little Ice Age. Summers grew shorter and cooler, winters longer and more severe. The sea ice, which had been a manageable hazard, began to linger longer in the fjords, blocking crucial shipping lanes for months at a time. This had a direct, devastating impact on their two-pillar economy. The shorter growing season meant less hay could be harvested to feed their livestock through the winter. Herds dwindled. Simultaneously, the extended sea ice made the vital summer voyages to the northern hunting grounds, the North Osseta, more dangerous and often impossible. The supply of walrus ivory, their most valuable export, dried up. This triggered the second crisis, economic irrelevance. Back in Europe, tastes were changing. Elephant ivory from Africa was becoming more readily available, and it was easier to carve than dense walrus tusk. The market for Greenland's prime commodity collapsed. The last recorded trade ship from Norway arrived in the late 14th century. After that, the lifeline was cut. No more iron tools, no more timber for ship repair, no more luxury goods or news from the outside world. The Greenlanders were stranded, forced into a desperate self-sufficiency with a technology base that was slowly wearing out. Into this landscape of struggle came a new people, the Thule culture, the ancestors of the modern Inuit. They began migrating from the west into Greenland around the 1300s. They were supremely adapted to the Arctic in ways the Norse were not. They hunted seal and whale from sleek kayaks and umiaks, used toggle harpoons that could float, and built warm, portable homes of skin and snow. The archaeological record shows some evidence of trade, bits of Norse metal found in Thule sites, but it also hints at a tense coexistence. The sagas mention skirmishes with people they called Skraelings, and as resources grew scarcer, conflict likely intensified. The Norse, with their fixed stone farms and pastoral lifestyle, were competing for the same coastal resources with a culture far better equipped to exploit them. So why didn't they simply adapt? Why not learn to hunt seal like the Inuit or adopt their technologies? This is the core of the mystery. The Greenland Norse were profoundly conservative. Their identity was tied to being European Christians, raising cattle, wearing wool, and living in stone and turf houses. To abandon that for a nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyle may have been seen as a step into barbarism, a loss of their very souls. Their church tithes, paid in walrus ivory, were a testament to their desire to remain part of Christendom. When that connection snapped, they were left culturally adrift in a hardening world. The final acts are fragments. A letter from 1409 mentions the marriage of a Greenlander in Iceland, suggesting some were leaving. The last written record is a record of a Christian wedding held in the church at Valsey in the eastern settlement in the year 1408. After that, silence. When a Norwegian ship finally made the arduous journey to Greenland again in the 1540s, they found only empty farms. At the western settlement, they reported finding a lone, dead Norseman lying face down on the beach, still wearing his hooded cloak and homespun clothing. In the eastern settlement, they found wild, untended livestock and deserted homesteads. The leading theory today is not a single catastrophe, but a slow cascade. A series of bitterly cold years in the early 15th century could have been the final straw. With trade gone, hunting failing, and livestock dead, the survivors faced a grim choice: starve in place or leave. Some may have attempted a desperate voyage back to Iceland in worn-out, unseaworthy ships, lost to the Atlantic. Others may have slowly dispersed, perhaps integrating with Inuit groups in small numbers, their European lineage dissolving into the Arctic. The Greenland Norse did not vanish in a day. They faded farm by farm, family by family, until the wind was the only sound where their hymns once echoed, a quiet end to one of history's most resilient and tragic expeditions. The silent stones of Greenland hold one kind of truth, but a living voice from the far north gives us another. At the court of King Alfred the Great, a Norse chieftain named Otter, or Other as he is sometimes called, presented a report so meticulous it became a priceless snapshot of the Arctic world. He was not a conqueror seeking fame, but a trader and a scout, and his words, carefully recorded by Alfred's scribes, reveal the Viking as a keen ethnographer and the linchpin of a vast northern economy. Otter described sailing from his home in northern Norway, farther north than any Norse settlement, into a land where the summer sun never set. His primary interest was wealth, but not the silver of the south. His riches were measured in furs and ivory, and the key to that wealth was a people he called the Finners, the Sami. He observed their nomadic life with the eye of a businessman. The Sami were expert hunters and reindeer herders, masters of an environment the Norse themselves found challenging. They paid tribute to chieftains like Otter, not in coin, but in the most valuable commodities of the north: otter skins, marten furs, reindeer hides, and walrus hide ropes. This was not a simple plunder, it was a sophisticated, established economic relationship. The Sami produced the goods, and the Norse chieftains acted as middlemen, funneling these Arctic luxuries south into the trade networks that reached the courts of Europe. His voyage defined the very edges of Norse territory. He explained that the land of the Norwegians was long and narrow, all cultivable land lying to the west, and to the east over mountains lay the vast swaths where the Sami hunted. He sailed until the coast turned sharply east, rounding the North Cape, and then south into the White Sea, a journey that mapped the outermost rim of the known world. He even encountered another culture, the Bjarmians, near a great river's mouth, noting their distinct language and settled farms. Otter's report is devoid of saga-like heroics. Instead, it is filled with practical details, sailing times, resource lists, and observations of different ways of life. He gave Alfred a census of his own wealth, 600 tame reindeer, and the tribute from the Sami, a fortune counted in living creatures and bundles of fur, not silver. The immense value of this expedition is its grounded, almost scientific perspective. It shows us a Viking world deeply interconnected, where chieftains in the far north were nodes in a supply chain that stretched from the Arctic tundra to the royal halls of Wessex. Otter was not just exploring geography, he was auditing an ecosystem. His account proves that the Norse drive to understand and exploit their environment was as sophisticated as their skill in building ships. They were not just raiders at the gates of civilization, they were the essential link, the middlemen who made the frozen reaches of the planet part of a medieval global trade. And as some documented the northern networks, others were drawn to a land that promised not furs, but a far more volatile treasure, buried in the sacred soil of an island monastery. The quiet accounting of a fur trader's ledger gives way to the thunder of 1,000 shields clashing. Some expeditions are remembered not in stone or silver, but in the soaring poetry of legend, and none looms larger in the Norse imagination than the Battle of Bravelir. This was not a raid for treasure, but a cataclysmic war for the fate of Scandinavia itself, a story so epic it stretches the very fabric of history. The saga tells of a titanic struggle in the 8th century between the aged Danish king Harald Hardrada, who sought a warrior's death to avoid dying in his bed, and his nephew, the Swedish king Sigurd Eitring. To settle their claim, they summoned the might of the entire north. Kings and champions sailed from every fjord and forest, from Norway and Sweden, from Denmark and the Baltic shores. The sagas speak of armies so vast they could drink rivers dry, and of heroes whose names alone were weapons. On the great plain of Bravelir, these forces met in a chaos of iron and fury, a day-long melee where shield walls shattered and legends were born and broken. In the end, Sigurd Eitring prevailed, and Harald Hardrada found the glorious end he sought, dying amidst a mountain of slain foes. Yet for all its vivid detail, most historians agree the Battle of Bravelir never happened as told. There is no archaeological evidence of such a colossal engagement. No contemporary chronicle mentions it. It is a foundational myth, a story crafted centuries later to explain the shifting tides of power and ancestry. So why did this legend hold such power? Why did generations of skalds keep alive the memory of a war that likely never was? The answer lies in what the story represents. Tales of Bravelir served as a cultural anchor, a shared memory of a time when all Scandinavians could be united under a single, monumental cause, even if that cause was war. It reflected a deep-seated memory of earlier, large-scale conflicts in the Baltic region, a time before the Viking Age, when tribal confederations and early kingdoms clashed for supremacy. These stories provided a heroic past for the ruling families who claimed descent from the champions of that day. More importantly, they codified the Viking ideal of the great expedition, the Leithanga, where every free man was called to arms by his king or jarl to join a collective fleet. Bravelir was this concept writ large, a mythic prototype for the coalitions that would later sack Paris and invade England. It taught that true glory was found not in solitary raids, but in standing shoulder to shoulder with heroes from across the sea, in a struggle that would echo through the ages. The legend was a mirror showing the Norse not just who they were, but who they believed they were destined to be. And if one legendary battle forged an identity, another, very real confrontation would shatter one kingdom and birth another far across the sea in a land of emerald green. The silence of Greenland's final farms is a profound mystery, but it raises a question that pushes the very limits of our imagination. If the Norse could cross the Atlantic to Vinland and survive for centuries on the edge of the Arctic, how much further could their desperation or curiosity have taken them? There exists a fringe, breathtaking theory that some of them did not vanish, but instead vanished into the map, sailing west from their failing settlements, following the coastlines of ice and permafrost until they reached a new continent's opposite shore. This is the speculative saga of a potential Norse expedition to the permafrost coast of Siberia. The logic, while tenuous, follows a thread of geography. From the western hunting grounds of Greenland, a determined crew in a sturdy gnaw could have navigated the labyrinth of islands in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, a route known as the Northwest Passage, though for them it would have been simply a continuation of their world. They were expert hunters of walrus and narwhal, accustomed to sailing among icebergs and reading the signs of the polar sea. Could they have island-hopped across what is now Nunavut, following the leads in the summer ice, living off the land and sea as they went? The distance is staggering, but it is a coastline, not an open ocean crossing, and for a people who routinely sailed from Norway to Greenland, the idea is not entirely out of the realm of physical possibility. The journey would have been a slow, generational crawl, not a single voyage. Families might have established temporary camps, overwintering in stone shelters, their boats gradually working their way along the top of the world. Over decades, perhaps even a century or two, such a migration could theoretically have traversed the northern edge of North America, eventually reaching the Bering Strait and the shores of Siberia. This is where the theory collides with a handful of enigmatic, hotly debated artifacts. In 1948, a researcher named Dr. Froelich Rainey was excavating a site at Point Barrow, Alaska, a place deeply connected to Inuit and pre-Inuit cultures. Among the layers, he uncovered several rusted links of chainmail armor. The style was consistent with European mail from the 11th or 12th centuries, a technology utterly foreign to indigenous Alaskan societies at that time. How did it get there? Proponents of the trans-Arctic Norse theory point to this as potential evidence, a solitary piece of hardware lost or traded by a far-traveling Viking. Skeptics, however, offer more plausible explanations. The mail could have been traded across immense distances through indigenous networks, perhaps originating from later Russian explorers or even from the doomed Franklin expedition in the 19th century. It is a ghost of evidence, intriguing but ultimately silent on its origin story. Other scattered clues have been put forward, like certain carved wooden objects or disputed rune-like markings, but none have withstood scholarly scrutiny. The archaeological consensus is clear. There is no solid, verifiable proof of a Norse presence anywhere along the Arctic coast of North America west of Greenland. No settlements, no burials, no definitive Norse tools. The chainmail remains an outlier, an anomaly without a context. So why does this idea persist? Because it speaks to our fascination with the ultimate what if. It tests the boundaries of human endurance and the outer reach of the Viking horizon. If true, it would mean the Norse circumnavigated the globe from the east centuries before Magellan, albeit along its frozen crown. It would be the final, most epic expedition of all, a diaspora from a dying colony into the absolute unknown. While the evidence firmly says no, the landscape itself whispers a tantalizing maybe. The Arctic coastline is a perfect highway for a people who lived by the sea ice, and the silence of the archaeological record there is as vast as the tundra itself. Perhaps the truth is not in a chainmail shirt, but in a story that was never carved in runes, a journey so final that those who made it became part of the ice and the long night, leaving no trace but the enduring question of how far the human spirit can truly go when the world behind it is closing down. The chainmail in the Alaskan permafrost is a ghost, but the legacy of one Viking chieftain is etched into the stone of castles and the pages of history books. In the year 911, a massive Viking fleet, weary from years of raiding up the Seine, once again threatened the very gates of Paris. Their leader was a formidable Norse chieftain named Rollo, a man whose size was said to be so great no horse could carry him. For King Charles the Simple, ruler of a fractured West Francia, this was not just another raid, it was an existential crisis he could no longer afford. He could not defeat Rollo in battle, but he possessed something else the Viking leader might want: legitimacy. Charles offered a deal of staggering consequence. If Rollo would cease his attacks, swear loyalty to the Frankish crown, and convert to Christianity, the king would grant him and his men a permanent homeland, a fertile slice of coastal territory along the English Channel. This was not Danegeld, a payment to go away. This was an invitation to stay, to become part of the realm. The territory would be known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Rollo, perhaps seeing the limits of a life of endless plunder, accepted. In a ceremony of profound symbolism, Rollo was required to kiss the king's foot as an act of homage. The sagas say the proud Viking, unwilling to bend, ordered one of his warriors to do it instead. The warrior, lifting the king's foot to his lips, accidentally tipped Charles off his throne, a moment of clumsy farce that marked the birth of a dynasty. The transformation that followed was one of the most remarkable in the Viking Age. Rollo and his Norse followers did not simply occupy Normandy, they built it. They distributed the land among themselves, not as raiders but as feudal lords constructing castles to secure their hold. They married Frankish noblewomen, adopted the local language, and embraced the Christian faith with a convert's zeal, founding great monasteries like the Abbey of Fécamp. Within a generation, they were no longer Vikings, they were Normans, a hybrid culture that fused Norse martial prowess, seamanship, and ambition with Frankish law, religion, and chivalric custom. They became the ultimate adapters, and their ambition only grew. This expedition, which began as a siege, ended by creating a powerhouse. Rollo's descendants, the Dukes of Normandy, became some of the most powerful figures in Europe. And just over a century and a half later, that ambition would reach its logical, world-altering conclusion. In 1066, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, Duke William, claimed the English throne. He built an invasion fleet not of longships but of a new, broader design, and crossed the Channel to defeat King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. William the Conqueror did not lead a Viking raid. He executed a Norman conquest, but the blood of Rollo and his sea kings flowed in his veins. The expedition of 911 had come full, devastating circle, proving that the most successful Viking journey of all was the one where they finally came ashore to stay, trading their ships for a kingdom that would itself conquer empires. Thorfinn Karlsefni's expedition was the ultimate Viking gamble on the New World. He was not a lone explorer, but a wealthy Icelandic merchant with a practical vision. After hearing the tantalizing tales from Leif Erikson's camp, he assembled a fleet unlike any that had sailed west before. He loaded ships not just with warriors, but with families, artisans, and a crucial cargo of livestock, including cattle, sheep, and pigs. This was no summer scouting trip. It was a deliberate, organized effort to plant a permanent, self-sustaining colony in Vinland the Good. They sailed from Greenland with high hopes, likely using Leif's old camp at El Ant's Ox Meadows as their initial base before pushing further south in search of the ideal location described in the sagas, a place of wild grapes and abundant pasture. For a time, the dream seemed within reach. They built their turf houses and established their farms. The livestock grazed in the new meadows, and the settlement took on the feel of a transplanted Icelandic homestead. Then, as the sagas recount, the Skraelings appeared. The first encounters were cautious but peaceful. The indigenous people, curious about these newcomers, approached the Norse settlement. Trade began with the Skraelings offering furs and pelts in exchange for cloth and, most notably, milk products. This fragile barter system held for a season, a brief, hopeful chapter of cross-cultural contact. During this period of relative peace, a momentous event occurred. Thorfinn's wife, Gudrid, gave birth to a son. They named him Snorri Thorfinnsson, and in that act, a new line was begun, the first documented child of European descent born in the Americas, a living symbol of the Norse intention to stay. But the peace was built on a foundation of profound misunderstanding and mutual suspicion. The sagas describe a turning point. The Norse had brought a bull with them, and one day the animal, perhaps startled, broke loose and bellowed loudly, charging toward the woods. The Skraelings, who had never seen such a creature, were terrified. They fled back to their own people. This single incident shattered the fragile trust. When the Skraelings returned, it was not to trade but to fight. They came in greater numbers and the conflict was fierce. The Norse, with their iron weapons and armor, held a technological advantage, but they were vastly outnumbered in a land where their enemies knew every forest trail and river bend. The sagas tell of a pivotal moment when the Skraelings used a strange tactic, rolling what appeared to be a large, dark ball toward the Norse line. It made a fearsome noise as it moved, causing panic until a brave Norsewoman, Freydis, seized a sword and confronted it, frightening the attackers away. Whether this was a rolled animal skin or a symbolic war standard, the story highlights the psychological terror of fighting an enemy whose methods were utterly alien. Thorfinn Karlsefni, the pragmatic leader, faced a grim calculation. His colony was under siege. Every venture outside the palisade for timber, water, or grazing was a risk. While they could win individual skirmishes, they could not secure the land. The economic foundation was also crumbling. The effort to defend themselves and tend livestock in a state of constant alertness was unsustainable. After 3 hard years, the decision was made. They would abandon Vinland. They loaded their surviving people, their remaining animals, and whatever goods they could carry back onto their ships and sailed east, first to Greenland and then to Iceland. Snorri, the American-born son, would grow up in Iceland, his birthplace a story from a failed frontier. Thorfinn's expedition represents the high water mark of Norse ambition in North America. It proved that settlement was physically possible, but it also revealed the insurmountable obstacles. The failure was not due to a lack of courage or planning, but to a fundamental reality. They were attempting to implant a European pastoral society into a landscape that was already home to powerful, established cultures who would defend their territory. The dream of Vinland as a permanent Norse colony died with Thorfinn's retreat. While Greenlanders would likely return for occasional timber-gathering voyages to Markland for centuries, the grand vision of a Western settlement vanished, leaving only sagas and a single, silent archaeological site as whispers of what might have been. The slaughter at Lindisfarne taught a brutal lesson, but the Vikings were quick students. They learned that the greatest concentrations of wealth were not in the fortified halls of kings, but in the undefended, hallowed halls of God. And no place in the British Isles was more sacred or more vulnerable than the tiny island of Iona. This was not just another monastery, it was the spiritual heart of Celtic Christianity, founded by Saint Columba in the 6th century. From this remote outpost, monks had carried the faith across Scotland and into northern England. Its scriptorium was a luminous workshop of faith, where some of the most beautiful manuscripts in the world were painstakingly illuminated. Iona was a beacon, and in the year 795, just 2 years after Lindisfarne, that beacon drew the dragon ships. The first raid was a shock of pure terror. The monks, living a life of prayer and artistic creation, had no defense against the warriors who stormed ashore. Many were killed where they stood at their altars and writing desks. The Vikings looted the monastery of its gold and silver liturgical objects, shattered sacred reliquaries, and left the community reeling. But this was not a one-time event. It was the beginning of a decades-long siege against the soul of a culture. The Vikings returned to Iona again and again in 802, in 806, and with particular ferocity in 825. Each attack followed a grim pattern: slaughter, plunder, and desecration. The death toll mounted into the dozens, then the hundreds. The message was clear: nowhere was safe, not even on this island at the edge of the world. Among the treasures created in Iona's scriptorium was a book of such staggering beauty it defies the violence of its time, the Book of Kells. This illuminated gospel, with its intricate, swirling designs and vibrant colors, is a testament to the profound devotion of the monks. While its exact origins are debated, many scholars believe it was begun on Iona. The Viking raids provide the most likely reason for its journey. The monks, fleeing for their lives, gathered their most precious possessions and fled across the sea to the relative safety of Ireland, taking the unfinished masterpiece with them to the Abbey of Kells. The book we marvel at today is therefore a survivor, a refugee of Viking terror. Its very existence is a silent witness to the panic and preservation that followed each raid. The repeated devastation of Iona sent a psychological shockwave through the religious networks of Britain and Ireland that was even deeper than the loss of gold. If a place as holy as Iona, under the direct protection of Saint Columba, could be violated with such impunity, what did that say about the power of the Christian God? It sparked a crisis of faith among the faithful and forced a radical reorganization of monastic life. Communities began to build round towers, not as bell towers but as fortresses, places where monks could retreat with their relics and manuscripts when the warning bell sounded. The very architecture of piety was redesigned for defense. The raids on Iona transformed the Vikings from a physical threat into a spiritual one, challenging the divine order itself and proving that their expeditions could shatter the peace of heaven on earth. The wealth of the northern forests meant nothing if it could not reach the glittering markets of the south. For the Rus traders, this meant committing their lives and fortunes to the most perilous river highway in the world, the Dnieper. Their journey from the fortified towns of the north to the golden domes of Constantinople was a 1,000-mile gauntlet, and its most infamous stretch was a series of 7 cataracts where the river boiled through granite gorges. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, writing in the 10th century, left us a chillingly precise account. He recorded the Norse and Slavic names for each rapid, names that spoke of sheer terror. The first was called Esupi, which means "do not sleep," a warning against the relentless current. Another was called Gelandri, the roaring one, but the most telling was the 4th cataract, a massive, frothing chute of white water. In Slavic it was called Afer, in Norse it was Ifor. Both names carried the same dreadful meaning, ever fierce. Navigating these was not a matter of skill but of survival. For the smaller rapids, the crew would row with all their might, steering through narrow channels between jagged rocks, the water screaming around them. For the larger ones, like the Ever Fierce, there was no passage. The only option was the portage, a back-breaking ordeal that made them utterly vulnerable. They would unload every precious bale of fur, every amphora of honey, every captive destined for the slave markets. Then, using log rollers, they would physically drag their heavy wooden boats out of the water and across miles of rocky, uneven ground, all while watching the tree line. This was the domain of the Pechenegs, nomadic steppe warriors who watched the river like hawks. To them, these lumbering processions of foreigners were not traders but moving treasure chests. An attack during a portage was a nightmare scenario. The Rus, weighed down by their cargo and their vessels, could not form a proper shield wall. They were exposed, tired, and fighting on unfamiliar terrain. The Pechenegs, masters of the horse and bow, could strike from a distance and vanish back into the grasslands. Many a trading expedition ended here, not in the markets of Miklagard, but in a bloody ambush on a riverbank, their goods scattered and their bodies left for the crows. This constant shadow of violence forced the Vikings to become diplomats as much as warriors. They often traveled in large convoys for mutual protection, and they understood the grim economics of the passage. It was sometimes wiser to pay a toll in goods to local Pecheneg chieftains for safe passage, a riverine version of Danegeld, than to risk losing everything. The journey shaped their very identity. To be a Rus merchant was to accept that the road to fortune was paved with drowned comrades and the arrows of steppe nomads. Yet the reward waiting at the end of this liquid hell was beyond imagination. Once past the final rapid, the Dnieper widened into a calm, majestic flow leading to the Black Sea. From there, it was a sail south with the coast in sight, until the walls of Constantinople itself rose from the horizon, a vision of marble and gold that justified every hardship. This treacherous middle leg, more than any other, was the crucible that forged the Rus. It filtered for only the toughest, smartest, and luckiest, turning northern hunters into the merchant princes who would one day command kingdoms. But the sagas hold more than just histories of known lands. They whisper of places that exist only on the edges of the map, in the space between memory and myth. One of the most haunting is Eikfitramanaland, the land of the white men, a place also called Great Ireland. This was not a destination anyone sailed to on purpose. It was a place you stumbled upon when the winds of fate turned against you. The tale centers on a man named Leif Erikson, a trader sailing from Dublin to Iceland in the early 11th century. His ship was caught in a ferocious westerly gale, driven far out into the Atlantic beyond any known sailing route. When the storm finally relented, they made landfall on a strange coast. The land itself was not described as remarkable, but its people were. They came down to the shore, speaking a language that sounded to the Norse like Irish. Before Leif and his crew could understand what was happening, they were surrounded and taken captive. The situation looked dire until an older man, speaking through an interpreter, approached. He asked detailed questions about specific people and places in Iceland, questions only someone with intimate knowledge could ask. This elder was revealed to be none other than Bjorn Ashbrandsson, an Icelander who had vanished years before, presumed lost at sea. He had somehow ended up here, a respected figure among these Gaelic-speaking people. Bjorn warned Leif that he and his men were in great danger, that the locals were untrustworthy and planned to enslave or kill them. He secretly helped them repair their ship and gave them precise sailing directions to escape, but he refused to return with them, bound by an oath to stay. He sent gifts and messages back to his family in Iceland, and then Leif's crew fled, catching an easterly wind that brought them home. They never found that coast again. So what was Eikfitramanaland? The most plausible anchor for this story lies in the Papar, the Irish monks. Icelandic chroniclers themselves noted that when the Norse first arrived in Iceland, they found Irish books, bells, and croziers left behind by holy men who had sought solitude in the Northern Ocean. These monks, sailing in their small curraghs, likely did reach Iceland first, and perhaps even the Faroe Islands and Greenland. The saga tale of Great Ireland could be a folk memory of that earlier presence, expanded and mythologized over generations. A storm-driven Norse crew landing on, say, the west coast of Iceland and encountering the last remaining community of Irish hermits could easily have grown into a tale of a distant, lost kingdom across the sea. But the story tantalizes with other possibilities. Could it be a garbled account of a voyage to North America, where the Norse encountered not Skraelings but people they thought sounded Celtic? Some have speculated with little evidence about pre-Norse Irish crossings to the New World. Or is the entire tale simply a fantastic invention, a sailor's yarn meant to explain the mysterious disappearance of men like Bjorn Ashbrandsson? The power of Eikfitramanaland is that it lives in that ambiguous realm. It feels too specific to be pure fantasy, yet too strange to be straightforward history. It is an expedition that happens not across water, but across the misty border of story itself, reminding us that for the Norse, the ocean's greatest secrets were not always lands, but the fates of the people the sea swallowed and then, occasionally, spit out onto a shore beyond all knowing. The story of Erik is a whisper of the unknown, but the thunder of a single day in Ireland would reshape the known world. The Battle of Clontarf, fought on Good Friday in the year 1014, is often remembered in simple terms as the heroic Irish finally driving the Viking invaders into the sea. The truth is far more tangled, a brutal civil war where Viking and Irish bloodlines, loyalties, and ambitions were so intertwined they became impossible to separate. This was not a clash of two pure cultures, but the explosive climax of a century of fusion and rivalry. At the center of the storm was Sigtrygg Silkbeard, the Norse king of Dublin. His very name tells a story, Silkbeard, a nickname hinting at trade wealth and sophistication. He was not a foreign raider, but a Hiberno-Norse king, born in Ireland, a Christian ruler of a wealthy port city that had been a Viking foundation for nearly 200 years. His expedition was one of political survival. He had formed a fateful alliance with the rebellious Irish king of Leinster, Mael Mordor, who refused to acknowledge the overlordship of the High King of Ireland, Brian Boru. Brian, an aging but formidable ruler from the province of Munster, had spent decades painstakingly building a fragile unified kingdom. To challenge him, Sigtrygg did what any savvy Norse leader would do. He called for reinforcements from across the Viking world. He sent word to the Orkney Islands, to the Isle of Man, and even to warriors in Scandinavia, offering silver and the promise of plunder for their axes. On the other side, Brian Borus' army was itself a coalition. While its core was his own Munster forces and troops from Connacht, it also included Viking allies. Contingents from the Norse towns of Waterford and Limerick, rivals of Dublin, marched under Brian's banner. The lines were drawn, but they were drawn in shifting sand, a messy web of old grudges and new opportunism. The two massive armies met on the flat tidal fields just north of Dublin, near the River Tolka and the fishing weir of Clontarf. The scale was staggering for its time, with chroniclers suggesting tens of thousands of men on the field. The fighting that followed was a day-long slaughter of almost mythic intensity. It was not a battle of maneuver, but a grinding, chaotic series of duels between shield walls that locked, broke, and reformed in the mud. The Norse and Orcadian berserkers, warriors who fought in a frenzied trance, carved into the Irish lines with terrifying fury, but they were met by the disciplined ranks of Brian's seasoned troops. The noise must have been deafening, the crash of axe on shield, the screams of the wounded and dying, all under a spring sky on the most solemn day of the Christian calendar. The turning point came late in the day. As the Leinster and Viking alliance began to waver and break, a small group of fleeing Norsemen, possibly from the Orkney contingent, stumbled upon Brian Borus' camp. The High King, now in his 70s, had not taken part in the fighting, observing from a tent a short distance away, praying as was customary for a devout king on Good Friday. His personal guard was overwhelmed. Brian was killed there at the moment of his greatest victory. The irony is profound. His army had won the field. The forces of Dublin and Leinster were shattered, their leaders dead or fleeing. Sigtrygg Silkbeard watched the defeat from the walls of his city, but he survived. Yet the man who had unified Ireland lay dead. So what did this colossal expedition actually achieve? Clontarf did not drive the Norse out of Ireland. Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, and Limerick remained thriving Norse-Irish towns. What it broke was the dream of a Viking kingdom in Ireland. The ambition of rulers like Sigtrygg to dominate the whole island politically, to become high kings themselves, died on that field. The Norse would remain, but as powerful urban merchants and craftsmen, integral to Irish trade and politics, not as its would-be conquerors. The battle ended an age of Viking expansion and began an age of Norse integration. The true legacy of Clontarf is not a clean ending, but a messy beginning, the sound of a door slamming shut on one kind of conquest, even as another, quieter kind of coexistence carried on within the walls of Dublin's bustling streets. The clash at Clontarf settled Ireland's fate, but the sea road north led to a quieter, more enduring conquest. While kings fought for Dublin, Norse families were putting down deep roots among the scattered islands off Scotland's coast. This was not the work of a single fleet, but a slow, relentless tide of migration that would reshape the Hebrides and the Isle of Man for 500 years. The attraction was obvious. These islands offered superb harbors, rich fishing grounds, and fertile land, all positioned along the vital sea lane between Scandinavia and the Viking settlements in Ireland. Raiders came first, drawn by the wealthy monasteries of Iona and Applecross, but settlers followed close behind, bringing their language, their laws, and their longships. They did not arrive to an empty land. These islands were home to Gaelic-speaking peoples, the descendants of Irish settlers known as the Scotti. What followed was a complex dance of conflict and coexistence. In some places, the Norse overwhelmed the existing population. In others, they intermarried, creating a powerful new hybrid aristocracy. Over generations, this fusion produced the Kingdom of the Isles, a maritime realm ruled by the Lords of the Isles, often called in Gaelic the Rai in Scoil, the Kings of the Foreign Islands. This title itself is a perfect artifact of the fusion, a Gaelic name for a dynasty of Norse origin. Their power was based on the sea. From their strongholds on islands like Islay and Lewis, their fleets of swift galleys could control trade and project power across the entire region, answering more often to the King of Norway than any Scottish king on the mainland. The archaeological record tells this story of blended identity in silent, powerful ways. On the Isle of Man, a set of magnificent carved stone crosses stand in churchyards. Their form is Celtic, covered in the intricate interlace patterns beloved by Irish monks, but the scenes they depict are straight from Norse mythology. One shows the god Odin with his two ravens being consumed by the wolf Fenrir at Ragnarok. Another depicts Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, a hero from the Volsunga saga. Here, pagan Norse stories are immortalized in Christian stone by Gaelic craftsmen, a visual treaty between two worlds. Elsewhere, burial customs merged. A chieftain might be laid to rest in a classic Norse ship burial, surrounded by his weapons, but the grave could be marked by a cross slab bearing both runic and Gaelic inscriptions. Every artifact whispers of a society that was neither purely Viking nor purely Celtic, but something entirely new. Politically, the Kingdom of the Isles was a perpetual pivot point. Its lords swore fealty to the Crown of Norway, which viewed the Isles as vital stepping stones to its Irish sea interests. Yet geographically, they were entangled with the emerging Kingdom of Scotland, which coveted control over the western seaboard. The Lords of the Isles became masters of a dangerous game, playing Norway and Scotland against each other to maintain their own autonomy. They would pay nominal tribute to a Norwegian king one decade, and then swear allegiance to a Scottish monarch the next, always ensuring their own power on the water remained unchallenged. This delicate balance lasted until 1266, when the Treaty of Perth forced Norway to cede the Isles to Scotland. Even then, the hybrid culture persisted, its legacy enduring in the place names that still define the map. Names ending in Ness from Ness for headland or Bost from Bolstadr for farm are Norse fingerprints. The very name of the islands, the Hebrides, may derive from the Old Norse Havbredi, the islands on the edge of the sea. This centuries-long expedition created a world where a warrior could have a Norse name, worship in a Christian church, recite Gaelic poetry, and sail a ship whose design was perfected over generations in those very waters. It was conquest by assimilation, where the invaders were ultimately transformed by the land they seized, leaving behind a culture woven from two mighty traditions. And as some Norse roots grew deep in island soil, others were reaching for a prize of unimaginable spiritual weight, not on a misty coast, but in the sun-baked heart of the Christian world itself. Even the most grounded sagas sometimes point their prows toward the stars. Among the many place names that dot the Norse world, one stands out for its sheer, cryptic poetry, Mani. In some contexts, this is almost certainly the Isle of Man, a well-documented Viking hub in the Irish Sea. But the word holds a far grander, more luminous meaning in Old Norse. It is the name of the moon, the celestial body that chariots across the night sky, pursued by the wolf Hati. This simple homonym, this shared sound, sparked a legend that travels far beyond the Irish Sea. Later storytellers and even some modern fringe theorists took the idea and ran with it, weaving a tale of the ultimate Viking raid, a daring expedition not across water, but across the void of space to plunder the silver mountains of the moon itself. It is a wonderfully absurd and captivating image, dragon ships sailing on a sea of stars, their crews leaping onto a cratered shore to fight moon men and haul back cargoes of astral silver. Of course, this is pure myth, a flight of fancy, but its very existence is a masterclass in how to read the Viking sagas. These texts are not simple history books, they are layered tapestries woven from three distinct threads. The first is historical memory, the core of real events, voyages, and people, passed down orally for generations. The second is geographical reality, the true shape of coasts, the names of islands, the logic of sailing routes. And the third is the rich loom of mythology, the gods, the cosmic struggles, the poetic metaphors that gave meaning to the Norse world. The story of a raid on Mani, the moon, is what happens when a listener or a later writer forgets the weave and pulls on a single, glittering thread. They hear a tale of a raid on Mani, and instead of picturing the familiar island, they literalize the metaphor. They take the poetic description of the moon as a place, a realm one could theoretically travel to, and they graft it onto a historical framework of raiding. It is a confusion of categories, but a deeply human one. It shows how, for the Norse, the boundary between the earthly and the divine, the real and the symbolic, was often porous. The world was alive with meaning, where a place name could echo a god's name, and a successful voyage might be seen as mirroring the sun's own journey. So the next time you read of a Viking expedition to a place called Glisisvellir, the glittering plains, or to Utgard, the outer fences of the world, remember the raid on the moon. It is a reminder to hold two ideas in your mind at once. We must read these sources with a careful, critical eye, sifting for the bedrock of fact beneath the layers of story. But we must also read them with an imaginative heart, understanding that for the people who told them, the world was wider and stranger than any map could show, a place where history and legend sailed in the same ship under the same silver light. The moon was a poetic destination, but the stones of Sweden point to a very real journey, one that ended in the land of the Greeks. Scattered across the Swedish countryside, particularly in the region of Uppland, stand silent granite witnesses to this epic trek, the Greece runestones. These are not sagas written on vellum, but hard, permanent memorials carved by grieving families. One of the most famous is the Ed Stone, raised by a woman named Ragnvi in memory of her son. Its runes declare boldly and simply that he died in Grickland, the Norse name for the Byzantine Empire. He was not alone. Dozens of these stones bear the same phrase, a standardized epitaph for men who never returned from the south. Each one is a broken story, a life cut short thousands of miles from the birch forests of home. To understand the scale of their journey, trace the route they would have taken. A young Swede, answering the call of Miklagard, would first sail east across the Baltic to the trading towns of the Rus. There, he would join a caravan of merchants and mercenaries for the grueling river voyage. They would haul their ships from the Volkhov to the Dnieper, facing the deadly rapids and the ever-present threat of Pecheneg arrows on the steppe. Finally, bursting into the Black Sea, they would turn south, following the coastline until the impossible skyline of Constantinople rose from the water, its walls and golden domes a sight that must have stolen the breath of every northern boy. This was not a summer raid, it was a years-long commitment, a professional military career in the most sophisticated army on Earth. The Runestones tell us the cost. They speak of inheritance of estates left to brothers and mothers because the son who was meant to inherit had vanished into the imperial service. They hint at the wealth that could be won, with some stones commissioned with the very pay sent home from Byzantium, a last gift of foreign gold turned into local granite. But more than anything, they mark a cultural watershed. The sheer number of these Greece runestones proves that service in the Varangian Guard was not a rare adventure for a handful of outliers. It was a recognized, almost institutionalized path for Scandinavian warriors, a career choice that connected the fjords to the Bosporus as a matter of routine. These carved rocks are the physical proof of a diaspora of steel, showing us that the Norse world extended in a continuous chain of rivers, portages, and sea lanes all the way to the heart of the Mediterranean. They turn the myth of Miklagard into a postal address you could carve on your son's grave, a distant land that became a tragically common place for a Swedish mother to say her final goodbye. The Greece runestones mark the graves of men who never returned from glory, but the survival of an entire colony depended on a different kind of voyage, one measured not in glory but in grain and timber. For over 400 years, the lifeline of Norse Greenland was a single, unglamorous ship, the Nar. This was not a sleek longship built for raiding, but a broad, deep-bellied cargo vessel, the workhorse of the North Atlantic. Its annual journey from Iceland or Norway to the eastern settlement was the most critical expedition of all, a routine mission that meant the difference between life and a slow, silent extinction at the edge of the world. Imagine the scene each summer at the Greenlandic fjord. The settlers would scan the eastern horizon, their eyes straining for the familiar shape of a square sail. Their entire year hinged on this arrival. The Nar's hold was a treasure chest of absolute necessity. It carried the very bones of their European existence, heavy oak and pine timbers for repairing ships and roof beams, scarce iron for tools and nails, and perhaps most precious of all, barley and grain for bread and beer, crops that would not reliably grow in Greenland's short summers. Without these imports, their technology would literally wear out, their ships would rot, and their diet would shrink to nothing but seal meat and what little their farms could yield. The crossing itself was a monumental gamble. The captain had to navigate the Denmark Strait, a frigid corridor of fog, icebergs, and sudden gales. He had a narrow window, the few summer months when the pack ice retreated enough to allow passage. One wrong calculation, one unexpected storm, and the ship and its irreplaceable cargo could be lost to the sea, dooming the colony to a year of desperate scarcity. The successful arrival was a cause for celebration, but also for intense barter. In return for the life-giving imports, the Greenlanders loaded the Nar with the luxury goods that made their remote existence economically viable. Bundles of walrus ivory, precious narwhal tusks sold in Europe as unicorn horns, and thick furs from the northern hunts. This was the exchange, southern sustenance for northern exotics. Then, in the 14th century, the horizon stayed empty, the supply lines began to fail. The reasons were a cascade of misfortunes. The worsening climate of the Little Ice Age meant more sea ice for longer periods, making the route impossibly dangerous. Political changes in Norway shifted trade priorities, and the Black Death devastated the population and economy back home, reducing the will and the manpower for such perilous voyages. Perhaps most crucially, the market for Greenland's goods collapsed as elephant ivory from Africa became more fashionable than walrus tusk. The profit was gone. Why risk a ship for a cargo nobody wanted to buy? The last recorded Nar from the Royal Norwegian Trade Fleet arrived in the late 14th century. After that, the silence from the east was absolute. The Greenlanders were now truly alone. Their iron tools broke and could not be replaced. Their ships sprang leaks with no timber for repairs. Their grain reserves dwindled to nothing. The annual expedition of the Gnar was not just a trade route, it was a heartbeat. When the heartbeat stopped, the colony began its long, cold slide into oblivion, a stark lesson that the greatest expeditions are sometimes the ones that simply and faithfully come back. The silent horizon that doomed Greenland was a failure of logistics, but the most feared Viking expeditions answered to no king's supply lines. They were a brotherhood bound by iron laws and a hunger for war, the Jomsvikings. According to the sagas, their fortress was Jomsborg, a legendary stronghold said to be on the Baltic coast, perhaps at the mouth of the Oder River. It was less a town and more a military camp, a sanctuary for the most disciplined and ruthless warriors in the north. To enter this order was to renounce a normal life. Their code was unforgiving. No man could be admitted under the age of 18 or over 50, ensuring only those in their prime fighting years. No women were allowed within the fortress walls to prevent distraction or division. Quarrels between brothers were forbidden, and all disputes were brought before their chieftain for judgment. Most famously, no Jomsviking could show fear or flee from any enemy, regardless of the odds. To retreat was to be cast out in disgrace. They lived for battle, and their loyalty was to the brotherhood and its leader, not to any homeland. They were the ultimate mercenaries, sailing wherever the promise of silver or the scent of a great fight called them. Their reputation was a weapon in itself. The mere mention that Jomsvikings were in the enemy's shield wall could chill the blood of ordinary warriors. They fought with a cold, mechanical efficiency, their discipline a stark contrast to the frenzied rage of berserkers. Two great saga battles cemented their legend and their ultimate fate. The first was the Battle of Eikjørungavaga, fought off the coast of Norway around the year 986. A massive Jomsviking fleet in the service of the Danish king Harald Bluetooth invaded Norway to challenge the rule of Jarl Håkon Sigurdsson. The battle was a chaotic, bloody struggle at sea, ships locked together in a floating battlefield. The sagas say the Jomsvikings fought with terrible ferocity, but the turning point was supernatural. As the Norwegians began to waver, Jarl Håkon, a devoted pagan, performed a desperate sacrifice to the goddess Thorgerd. In response, a sudden and violent hailstorm erupted, lashing directly into the faces of the Jomsviking fleet, blinding them and turning the tide. Despite their code, the surviving Jomsvikings were forced to break and flee, a devastating blow to their myth of invincibility. Many were captured and executed on the spot in a brutal display by Jarl Håkon. Yet the brotherhood endured or was rebuilt. Their second great appearance came at the Battle of Esvolda in the year 1000. This time they sailed under the banner of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, who was allied with the Swedish king and the Norwegian Jarl Erik Hakonason against the ambitious Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason. The sagas paint Esvolda as a trap, with Olaf's fleet lured into a channel where the allied kings waited with overwhelming force. The Jomsvikings, commanded by the famed Sigvaldi Strutt Haraldsson, were at the heart of the attack. In the ferocious melee that followed, King Olaf's ship, the Long Serpent, became the focus of the battle. The Jomsvikings and their allies swarmed the legendary vessel. Olaf fought until the end before leaping overboard to his death, a defeat that reshaped Scandinavia. For the Jomsvikings, Esvolda was a triumph of mercenary loyalty, but it is also where their historical trail begins to fade into mist. No archaeological evidence of Jomsborg has ever been conclusively found, leading many scholars to argue they were more literary legend than historical reality. Yet the power of their story is undeniable. They represent the Viking ideal of the professional warrior distilled to its purest form. They were not settlers or explorers, but instruments of war, their entire existence a perpetual expedition in search of the next battle. Their saga gave future generations a template for the perfect, disciplined Viking, a brotherhood where glory was governed by a code, and every voyage was a contract written in blood and gold. The last true Viking ship ever built was not a dragon of the sea, but a ghost of one. In the late 10th century, as the pagan world was receding before the cross, a community in the Danish town of Ladby laid a chieftain to rest. They dragged a warship from the water, a vessel that was already a relic in its own time. Archaeologists who unearthed it centuries later found a skeleton of a ship, but one that told a story of decline. Its planks were thin and poorly fastened. Its iron rivets were irregular and sparse, the work of a blacksmith who perhaps no longer remembered the old standards. This was not the product of a master shipwright from a bustling port, but a local, hurried copy of a fading memory. They placed the chieftain in its center, surrounded by the treasures of his life and his status, 11 horses, 4 dogs, and his finest possessions. Then they covered the ship with a mound, turning it into a tomb, but the sea was missing. This ship was never meant to sail again, not even to the afterlife. Its final voyage was a few hundred yards up a gentle slope from the shore to the grave. This poignant burial forces us to ask, what was this voyage for? The man inside was clearly a person of importance, someone whose followers felt compelled to honor him with the most sacred ritual of their ancestors, the ship burial. Yet the means to do it properly were slipping away. The knowledge of how to build a true longship was dissipating, like mist off the fjords at dawn. The act feels less like a confident assertion of faith and more like a desperate, nostalgic grasp at a tradition that was already passing through their fingers. They were performing the old rites, but with a ship that could never again ride the whale road. It was a funeral for the age itself. The Ladby ship marks a quiet, archaeological full stop. The Viking Age did not end with a battle or a treaty, but with a gradual turning inward. The sea roads that had carried explorers to Constantinople and Vinland were now policed by Christian kings who taxed trade and raised national navies. The old gods of Thor and Odin, who blessed raids and promised a seat in Valhalla for those who died with a sword in hand, were replaced by a god who preached peace and salvation for the humble. The economic engines changed too. Why risk the open ocean for plunder when you could profit more safely from taxed herring fisheries and controlled market towns? The young men who once sought fame and fortune abroad could now find it serving in the royal huskarls of a unified Danish or Norwegian king. The world shrank from the boundless horizon to the ordered fields of a parish. The ship burial at Ladby is therefore a farewell in 2 layers. On the surface, it is a community saying goodbye to a beloved leader. But on a deeper, more resonant level, it is Scandinavia saying farewell to its defining identity. They buried a chieftain, but they also buried the sea king he represented, interring the very spirit of the longship under a blanket of earth. The mound became a seal, closing the book on an era of exploration, terror, and wonder. From its soil would grow the Christian kingdoms of the medieval North, kingdoms that would look back on the Viking Age not as their present, but as their wild, formidable past, a time of giants and dragon ships, now safely contained within the pages of a saga or the outline of a rusted rivet in a quiet field. From the shores of Canada to the walls of Constantinople, the Viking world was a breathtaking web of ambition, stretching far beyond the simple story of horned helmets and plundered monasteries. These 35 epic expeditions reveal a civilization of staggering complexity. They were explorers who dared to cross an ocean on a rumor, traders who connected the Arctic to Baghdad, settlers who carved farms from volcanic rock, and mercenaries who became the personal guard of emperors. Their story is not one of mindless destruction, but of relentless human energy pushing against every known horizon. The proof is all around us, written in the silent language of the land. It's in the Norse words that shape English speech, in the Slavic name for their own country, Rus, and in the Norman castles built by the descendants of Rollo. It's buried in the ship mounds of Ladby and etched onto the Greece runestones, each a frozen moment of grief and glory. Their legacy is not a relic of the past, but a living layer in the foundation of our world. So as we lower the sail on this journey, we're left with two final questions that echo across the centuries. Which of these voyages captured your imagination the most? Was it the stubborn hope of Thorfinn Karlsefni in Vinland, the disciplined brotherhood of the Jomsvikings, or the lonely final scan of the horizon by a Greenlander waiting for a ship that would never come? And do you believe their story is fully told? Could there still be undiscovered sagas waiting in the permafrost, or sunken longships resting in some forgotten fjord, holding secrets we have yet to learn? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed tracing these ancient routes across the map, hit that like button to help others find the journey. And subscribe so you never miss our next deep dive into history's greatest mysteries. Until then, farewell.